Chapter 6, Part 5 of an Inquiry into the Human Mind on the Principles of Common Sense. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Stephen Reynolds. An Inquiry into the Human Mind on the Principles of Common Sense by Thomas Reid. Chapter 6, Part 5. Section 19 of Dr. Briggs' theory and Sir Isaac Newton's conjecture on this subject. I am afraid the reader, as well as the writer, is already tired of the subject of single and double vision. The multitude of theories advanced by authors of great name, and the multitude of facts observed without sufficient skills in optics, or related without attention to the most material and decisive circumstances, have equally contributed to perplex it. In order to bring it to some issue, I have in the 13th section given a more full and regular deduction than had been given heretofore of the phenomena of single and double vision, in those whose sight is perfect, and have traced them up to one general principle, which appears to be a law of vision in human eyes that are perfect, and in their natural state. In the 14th section I have made it appear that this law of vision, although excellently adapted to the fabric of the human eye, cannot answer the purposes of vision in some other animals, and therefore very probably is not common to all animals. The purpose of the 15th and 16th sections is to inquire whether there be any deviation from this law of vision in those who squint, a question which is of real importance in the medical art, as well as in the philosophy of vision, but which after all hath been observed and written on this subject, seems not to be ripe for a determination, for want of proper observations. Those who have had skill to make proper observations have wanted opportunities, and those who have had opportunities have wanted skill or attention. I have therefore thought it worth while to give a distinct account of the observations necessary for the determinations of this question, and what conclusions may be drawn from the facts observed. I have likewise collected and set in one view the most conclusive facts that have occurred in authors, or have fallen under my own observation. It must be confessed that these facts, when applied to the question in hand, make a very poor figure, and the gentlemen of the medical faculty are called upon for the honour of their profession, and for the benefit of mankind, to add to them. All the medical and all the optical writers upon the strabismus that I have met with, except Dr. Jurin, either affirm or take it for granted that squinting persons see the object with both eyes, and yet see it single. Dr. Jurin affirms that squinting persons never see the object with both eyes, and that if they did, they would see it double. If the common opinion be true, the cure of a squint would be as pernicious to the sight of the patient as the causing of a permanent squint would be to one who naturally has no squint, and therefore no physician ought to attempt such a cure. No patient ought to submit to it. But if Dr. Jurin's opinion be true, most young people that squint may cure themselves by taking some pains, and may not only remove the deformity, but at the same time improve their sight. If the common opinion be true, the centres and other points of the two retinae in squinting persons do not correspond as in other men, and nature in them deviates from her common rule. But if Dr. Jurin's opinion be true, there is reason to think that the same general law of vision which we have found in perfect human eyes extends also to those which squint. It is impossible to determine by reasoning which of these opinions is true, or whether one may not be found true in some patients and the other in others. Here experience and observation are our only guides, and a deduction of instances is the only rational argument. It might therefore have been expected that the patrons of the contrary opinions should have given instances, in support of them, that are clear and indisputable. But I have not found one such instance, in either side of the question, and all the authors I have met with. I have given 3 instances from my own observation, in confirmation of Dr. Jurin's opinion, which admit of no doubt, and one which leans rather to the other opinion, but is dubious. And here I must leave the matter for further observation. In the 17th section, I have endeavoured to shew that the correspondence and sympathy of certain points of the 2 retinae, into which we have resolved all the phenomena of single and double vision, is not, as Dr. Smith conceived, the effect of custom, nor can be changed by custom, but is a natural and original property of human eyes, and in the last section, that it is not owing to an original and natural perception of the true distance of objects from the eye, as Dr. Porterfield imagined. After this recapitulation, which is intended to relieve the attention of the reader, shall we enter into more theories upon this subject? That of Dr. Briggs, first published in England in the Philosophical Transactions, afterwards in Latin under the title of Nova Visionis Theoria, with a prefatory epistle of Sir Isaac Newton to the author, amounts to this, that the fibres of the optic nerves passing from corresponding points of the retinae to the thalami nervorum opticorum, having the same length, the same tension, and a similar situation, will have the same tone, and therefore their vibrations, excited by the impression of the rays of light, will be like unisons in music, and will present one and the same image to the mind. But the fibres passing from parts of the retinae which do not correspond, having different tensions and tones, will have discordant vibrations, and therefore present different images to the mind. I shall not enter upon a particular examination of this theory. It is enough to observe, in general, that it is a system of conjectures concerning things of which we are entirely ignorant, and that all such theories in philosophy deserve rather to be laughed at than to be seriously refuted. From the first dawn of philosophy to this day it hath been believed that the optic nerves are intended to carry the images of visible objects from the bottom of the eye to the mind, and that the nerves belonging to the organs of the other senses have a like office. But how do we know this? We conjecture it, and taking this conjecture for a truth, we consider how the nerves may best answer this purpose. The system of the nerves for many ages was taken to be a hydraulic engine, consisting of a bundle of pipes which carried to and fro a liquor called animal spirits. About the time of Dr. Briggs, it was thought rather to be a stringed instrument, composed of vibrating cords, each of which had its proper tension and tone. But some, with as great probability, conceived it to be a wind instrument, which played its part by the vibrations of an elastic ether in the nervous fibrils. These, I think, are all the engines into which the nervous system hath been moulded by philosophers, for conveying the images of sensible things from the organ to the sensorium, and for all that we know of the matter, every man may freely choose which he thinks fittest for the purpose. For from fact and experiment, no one of them can claim preference to another. Indeed, they all seem so unhandy engines for carrying images, that a man would be tempted to invent a new one. Since, therefore, a blind man may guess as well in the dark as one that sees, I beg leave to offer another conjecture touching the nervous system, which I hope will answer the purpose as well as those we have mentioned, and which recommends itself by its simplicity. Why may not the optic nerves, for instance, be made up of empty tubes, opening their mouths wide enough to receive the rays of light, which form the image upon the retina, and gently conveying them safe and in their proper order to the very seat of the soul, until they flash in her face? It is easy for an ingenious philosopher to fit the calibre of these empty tubes to the diameter of the particles of light, so as they shall receive no grosser kind of matter. And if these rays should be in danger of mistaking their way, an expedient may also be found to prevent this, for it requires no more than to bestow upon the tubes of the nervous system a peristaltic motion like that of the alimentary tube. It is a peculiar advantage of this hypothesis that although all philosophers believe that the species or images of things are conveyed by the nerves to the soul, yet none of their hypotheses shew how this may be done. For how can the images of sound, taste, smell, colour, figure, and all sensible qualities be made out of the vibrations of musical chords, or the undulations of animal spirits, or of ether? We ought not to suppose means inadequate to the end. Is it not as philosophical and more intelligible to conceive that as the stomach receives its food, so the soul receives her images by a kind of nervous degulation? I might add that we need only continue this peristaltic motion of the nervous tubes from the sensorium to the extremities of the nerves that serve the muscles, in order to account for the muscular motion. Thus nature will be consonant to herself, and as sensation will be the conveyance of the ideal aliment to the mind, so muscular motion will be the expulsion of the recommentitious part of it. For who can deny that the images of things conveyed by sensation may, after due concoction, become fit to be thrown off by muscular motion? I only give hints of these things to the ingenious, hoping that in time this hypothesis may be wrought up into a system as truly philosophical as that of animal spirits or the vibration of nervous fibres. To be serious, in the operations of nature, I hold the theories of a philosopher, which are unsupported by fact, in the same estimation with the dreams of a man asleep, or the ravings of a madman. We laugh at the Indian philosopher, who, to account for the support of the earth, contrived the hypothesis of a huge elephant, and to support the elephant, a huge tortoise. If we will candidly confess the truth, we know as little of the operation of the nerves as he did of the manner in which the earth is supported, and our hypotheses about animal spirits, or about the tension and vibration of the nerves, are as like to be true as his about the support of the earth. His elephant was a hypothesis, and our hypotheses are elephants. Every theory in philosophy which is built on pure conjecture is an elephant, and every theory that is supported partly by fact and partly by conjecture is like Nebuchadnezzar's image, whose feet were partly of iron and partly of clay. The great Newton first gave an example to philosophers which always ought to be, but rarely hath been, followed. By distinguishing his conjectures from his conclusions, and putting the former by themselves in the modest form of queries. This is fair and legal, but all other philosophical traffic and conjecture ought to be held contraband and illicit. Indeed, his conjectures have commonly more foundation in fact, and more verisimilitude than the dogmatic theories of most other philosophers. And therefore we ought not to omit that which he hath offered concerning the cause of our seeing objects single with two eyes, in the 15th century annexed to his optics. Are not the species of objects seen with both eyes united, where the optic nerves meet, before they come into the brain, the fibres on the right side of both nerves uniting there, and after union going thence into the brain, in the nerve which is on the right side of the head, and the fibres on the left side of both nerves uniting in the same place, and after union going into the brain, in the nerve which is on the left side of the head, and these two nerves meeting in the brain in such a manner that their fibres make but one entire species or picture, half of which on the right side of the sensorium comes from the right side of both eyes, through the right side of both optic nerves, to the place where the nerves meet, and from thence on the right side of the head into the brain, and the other half on the left side of the sensorium comes in like manner from the left side of both eyes. For the optic nerves of such animals as look the same way with both eyes, as men, dogs, sheep, oxen, and etc., meet before they come into the brain, but the optic nerves of such animals as do not look the same way with both eyes, as of fishes and the chameleon, do not meet, and if I am rightly informed. I beg leave to distinguish this query into two, which are of very different natures, one being purely anatomical, the other relating to the carrying species or pictures of visible objects to the sensorium. The first question is, whether the fibres coming from the corresponding points of the two retinae do not unite at the place where the optic nerves meet, and continue united from thence to the brain, so that the right optic nerve, after the meeting of the two nerves, is composed of the fibres coming from the right side of both retinae, and the left of the fibres coming from the left side of both retinae. This is undoubtedly a curious and rational question, because if we could find ground from anatomy to answer it in the affirmative, it would lead us a step forward in discovering the cause of the correspondence and sympathy which there is between certain points of the two retinae. For although we know not what is the particular function of the optic nerves, yet it is probable that some impression made upon them, and communicated along their fibres, is necessary to vision. And whatever be the nature of this impression, if two fibres are united into one, an impression made upon one of them, or upon both, may probably produce the same effect. Anatomists think it a sufficient account of a sympathy between two parts of the body when they are served by branches of the same nerve. We should therefore look upon it as an important discovery in anatomy, if it were found that the same nerve sent branches to the corresponding points of the retinae. But hath any such discovery been made? No, not so much as in one subject, as far as I can learn, but in several subjects the contrary seems to have been discovered. Dr. Porterfield hath given us two cases at length from Vesalius, and one from Cassiopinus, wherein the optic nerves, after touching one another as usual, appeared to be reflected back to the same side whence they came, without any mixture of their fibres. Each of these persons had lost an eye some time before his death, and the optic nerve belonging to that eye was shrunk, so that it could be distinguished from the other at the place where they met. Another case, which the same author gives from Vesalius, is still more remarkable, for in it the optic nerves do not touch at all, and yet, upon inquiry, those who were most familiar with the person in his lifetime declared that he never complained of any defect of sight, or of his seeing objects double. Daemerbroek tells us that Aquapendens and Valverde likewise affirm that they have met with subjects wherein the optic nerves did not touch. As these observations were made before Sir Isaac Newton put this query, it is uncertain whether he was ignorant of them, or whether he suspected some inaccuracy in them, and desired that the matter might be more carefully examined. But from the following passage of the most accurate Winslow, it does not appear that later observations have been more favourable to his conjecture. The union of these optic nerves by the small curvatures of their conua is very difficult to be unfolded in human bodies. This union is commonly found to be very close, but in some subjects it seems to be no more than a strong adhesion, in others to be partly made by an intersection of crossing of fibres. They have been found quite separate, and in other subjects one of them has been found to be very much altered, both in size and colour, through its whole passage, the other remaining in its natural state. When we consider this conjecture of Sir Isaac Newton by itself, it appears more ingenious, and to have more verisimilitude than anything that has been offered upon the subject. And we admire the caution and modesty of the author, in proposing it only as a subject of inquiry. But when we compare it with the observations of anatomists, which contradict it, we are naturally led to this reflection. that if we trust to the conjectures of men of the greatest genius in the operation of nature, we have only the chance of going wrong in an ingenious manner. The second part of the query is, whether the two species of objects from the two eyes are not, at the place where the optic nerves meet, united into one species or picture, half of which is carried thence to the sensorium in the right optic nerve, and the other half in the left. Whether these two halves are not so put together again at the sensorium as to make one species or picture. Here it seems natural to put the previous question. What reason have we to believe that pictures of objects are at all carried to the sensorium, either by the optic nerves or by any other nerves? Is it not possible that this great philosopher, as well as many of a lower form, having been led into this opinion at first by education, may have continued in it because he never thought of calling it in question? I confess this was my own case for a considerable part of my life. But since I was led by accident to think seriously what reason I had to believe it, I could find none at all. It seems to be a mere hypothesis, as much as the Indian philosopher's elephant. I am not conscious of any pictures of external objects in my sensorium, any more than in my stomach. The things which I perceive by my senses appear to be external, and not in any part of the brain. And my sensations, properly so called, have no resemblances of external objects. The conclusion from all that hath been said, in no less than 7 sections upon our seeing objects single with 2 eyes, is this: that, by an original property of human eyes, objects painted upon the centres of the 2 retinae, or upon points similarly situate with regard to the centres, appear in the same visible place; that the most plausible attempts to account for this property of the eye have been unsuccessful, and therefore that it must be either a primary law of our constitution, or the consequence of some more general law which is not yet discovered. We have now finished what we intended to say, both of the visible appearances of things to the eye, and of the laws of our constitution by which those appearances are exhibited. But it was observed in the beginning of this chapter that the visible appearances of objects serve only as signs of their distance, magnitude, figure, and other tangible qualities. The visible appearance is that which is presented to the mind by nature according to those laws of our constitution which have been explained. But the thing signified by that appearance is that which is presented to the mind by custom. When one speaks to us in a language that is familiar, we hear certain sounds, and this is all the effect that his discourse has upon us by nature. But by custom we understand the meaning of these sounds, and therefore we fix our attention not upon the sounds, but upon the thing signified by them. In like manner, we see only the visible appearance of objects by nature, but we learn by custom to interpret these appearances and to understand their meaning. And when this visual language is learned, and becomes familiar, we attend only to the things signified, and cannot, without great difficulty, attend to the signs by which they are presented. The mind passes from one to the other so rapidly and so familiarly that no trace of the sign is left in the memory, and we seem immediately, and without the intervention of any sign, to perceive the thing signified. When I look at the apple tree which stands before my window, I perceive at the first glance its distance and magnitude, the roughness of its trunk, the disposition of its branches, the figure of its leaves and fruit. I seem to perceive all these things immediately. The visible appearance which presented them all to the mind has entirely escaped me. I cannot, without great difficulty and painful abstraction, attend to it, even when it stands before me. Yet it is certain that this visible appearance only is presented to my eye by nature, and that I learned by custom to collect all the rest from it. If I had never seen before now, I should not perceive either the distance or tangible figure of the tree, and it would have required the practice of seeing for many months to change that original perception which nature gave me by my eyes, into that which I now have by custom. The objects which we see naturally and originally, as hath been before observed, have length and breadth, but no thickness nor distance from the eye. Custom, by a kind of legerdemain, withdraws gradually from these original and proper objects of sight, and substitutes in their place objects of touch, which have length, breadth, and thickness, and a determinate distance from the eye. By what means this change is brought about, and what principles of the human mind concur in it, we are next to inquire. Section 20. Of Perception in General. Sensation and the perception of external objects by the senses, though very different in their nature, have commonly been considered as one and the same thing. The purposes of common life do not make it necessary to distinguish them, and the received opinions of philosophers tend rather to confound them. But without attending carefully to this distinction, it is impossible to have any just conception of the operations of our senses. The most simple operations of the mind admit not of a logical definition. All we can do is to describe them, so as to lead those who are conscious of them in themselves to attend to them and reflect upon them, and it is often very difficult to describe them so as to answer this intention. The same mode of expression is used to denote sensation and perception, and therefore we are apt to look upon them as things of the same nature. Thus I feel a pain, I see a tree. The first denoteth a sensation, the last a perception. The grammatical analysis of both expressions is the same, for both consist of an active verb and an object. But if we attend to the things signified by these expressions, we shall find that in the first the distinction between the act and the object is not real, but grammatical. In the second, the distinction is not only grammatical, but real. The form of the expression, I feel pain, might seem to imply that the feeling is something distinct from the pain felt. Yet in reality there is no distinction. As thinking a thought is an expression which would signify no more than thinking, so feeling a pain signifies no more than being pained. What we have said of pain is applicable to every other mere sensation. It is difficult to give instances, very few of our sensations having names, and where they have, the same being common to the sensation, and to something else which is associated with it. But when we attend to the sensation by itself, and separate it from other things which are conjoined with it, in the imagination, it appears to be something which can have no existence, but in a sentient mind, no distinction from the act of the mind by which it is felt. Perception, as we here understand it, hath always an object distinct from the act by which it is perceived, an object which may exist whether it be perceived or not. I perceive a tree that grows before my window. There is here an object which is perceived, and an act of the mind by which it is perceived. And these two are not only distinguishable, but they are extremely unlike in their natures. The object is made up of a trunk, branches, and leaves, but the act of the mind by which it is perceived hath neither trunk, branches, nor leaves. I am conscious of this act of my mind, and I can reflect upon it, but it is too simple to admit of an analysis, and I cannot find proper words to describe it. I find nothing that resembles it so much as the remembrance of the tree, or the imagination of it. Yet both these differ essentially from the perception. They differ likewise one from another. It is in vain that a philosopher assures me that the imagination of the tree, the remembrance of it, and the perception of it are all one and differ only in degree of vivacity. I know the contrary, for I am as well acquainted with all the three as I am with the apartments of my own house. I know this also, that the perception of an object implies both a conception of its form and a belief of its present existence, I know, moreover, that this belief is not the effect of argumentation and reasoning. It is the immediate effect of my constitution. I am aware that this belief which I have in perception stands exposed to the strongest batteries of skepticism, but they make no great impression upon it. The skeptic asks me, "Why do you believe the existence of the external object which you perceive?" This belief, sir, is none of my manufacture. It came from the mint of nature. It bears her image and subscription, and if it is not right, the fault is not mine. I even took it upon trust and without suspicion. Reason, says the skeptic, is the only judge of truth, and you ought to throw off every opinion and every belief that is not grounded on reason. Why, sir, should I believe the faculty of reason more than that of perception? They came both out of the same shop, and were made by the same artist. And if he puts one piece of false ware into my hands, what should it hinder him from putting another? Perhaps the skeptic will agree to distrust reason, rather than give any credit to perception. For, says he, since by your own concession, the object which you perceive, and the act of your mind, by which you perceive it, are quite different things. The one may exist without the other, and as the object may exist without being perceived, so the perception may exist without an object. There is nothing shameful in a philosopher as to be deceived and deluded, and therefore you ought to resolve firmly to withhold assent, and to throw off this belief of external objects which may be all delusion. For my part, I will never attempt to throw it off, and although the sober part of mankind will not be very anxious to know my reasons, yet if they can be of use to any skeptic, they are these. First, because it is not in my power, why then should I make a vain attempt? It would be agreeable to fly to the moon, and to make a visit to Jupiter and Saturn, but when I know that nature has bound me down by the law of gravitation to this planet which I inhabit, I rest contented, and quietly suffer myself to be carried along in its orbit. My belief is carried along by perception as irresistibly as my body by the earth, and the greatest skeptic will find himself to be in the same condition. He may struggle hard to disbelieve the information of his senses, as a man does to swim against a torrent, but it is in vain. It is in vain that he strains every nerve and wrestles with nature, and with every object that strikes upon his senses. For after all, when his strength is spent in the fruitless attempt, he will be carried down the torrent with the common herd of believers. Secondly, I think it would not be prudent to throw off this belief, if it were in my power. If nature intended to deceive me, and impose upon me by false appearances, and I, by my great cunning and profound logic, have discovered the imposture, prudence would dictate to me in this case even to put up this indignity done me as quietly as I could, and not to call her an impostor to her face, lest she should be even with me in another way. For what do I gain by resenting this injury? You ought at least not to believe what she says. This indeed seems reasonable, if she intends to impose upon me. But what is the consequence? I resolve not to believe my senses. I break my nose against a post that comes in my way. I step into a dirty kennel, and after 20 such wise and rational actions, I am taken up and clapped into a madhouse. Now, I confess, I would rather make one of the credulous fools, whom nature imposes upon, than of those wise and rational philosophers, who resolve to withhold assent at all this experience. If a man pretends to be a skeptic with regard to the informations of sense, and yet prudently keeps out of harm's way as other men do, he must excuse my suspicion that he either acts the hypocrite, or imposes upon himself. For if the scale of his belief were so evenly poised as to lean no more to one side than to the contrary, it is impossible that his actions could be directed by any rules of common prudence. Thirdly, although the 2 reasons already mentioned are perhaps 2 more than enough, I shall offer a third. I give implicit belief to the informations of nature by my senses for a considerable part of my life, before I had learned so much logic as to be able to start a doubt concerning them. And now, when I reflect upon what is past, I do not find that I have been imposed upon by this belief. I find that without it I must have perished by 1,000 accidents. I find that without it I should have been no wiser now than when I was born. I should not even have been able to acquire that logic which suggests these sceptical doubts with regard to my senses. Therefore I consider this instructive belief as one of the best gifts of nature. I thank the author of my being, who bestowed it upon me, before the eyes of my reason were opened, and still bestows it upon me to be my guide, where reason leaves me in the dark. And now I yield to the direction of my senses, not from instinct only, but from confidence and trust in a faithful and beneficent monitor, grounded upon the experience of his paternal care and goodness. In all this I deal with the author of my being no otherwise than I thought it reasonable to deal with my parents and tutors. I believed by instinct whatever they told me, long before I had the idea of a lie, or thought of the possibility of their deceiving me. Afterwards, upon reflection, I found they had acted like fair and honest people, who wished me well. I found that if I had not believed what they told me, before I could give a reason of my belief, I had to this day been little better than a changeling. And although this natural credulity hath sometimes occasioned my being imposed upon by deceivers, yet it hath been of infinite advantage to me upon the whole. Therefore I consider it as another good gift of nature, and I continue to give that credit from reflection to those of whose integrity and veracity I have had experience, which before I gave from instinct. There is a much greater similitude than is commonly imagined between the testimony of nature given by our senses and the testimony of men given by language. The credit we give to both is at first the effect of an instinct only. When we grow up and begin to reason about them, the credit given to human testimony is restrained and weakened by the experience we have of deceit. But the credit given to the testimony of our senses is established and confirmed by the uniformity and constancy of the laws of nature. Our perceptions are of two kinds. Some are natural and original, others acquired and the fruit of experience. When I perceive that this is the taste of cider, that of brandy, that this is the smell of an apple, that of an orange, that this is the noise of thunder, that the ringing of bells, this the sound of a coach passing, that the voice of such a friend, these perceptions and others of the same kind are not original, they are acquired. But the perception which I have by touch of the hardness and softness of bodies, of their extension, figure, and motion, is not acquired, it is original. In all our senses, the acquired perceptions are many more than the original, especially in sight. By this sense we perceive originally the visible figure and colour of bodies only, and their visible place. But we learn to perceive by the eye almost everything which we can perceive by touch. The original perceptions of this sense serve only as signs to introduce the acquired. The signs by which objects are presented to us in perception are the language of nature to man, and as, in many respects, it hath great affinity with the language of man to man, so particularly in this, that both are partly natural and original, partly acquired by custom. Our original or natural perceptions are analogous to the natural language of man to man, of which we took notice in the 4th chapter, and our acquired perceptions are analogous to artificial language, which in our mother tongue is got very much in the same manner with our acquired perceptions, as we shall afterwards more fully explain. Not only men, but children, idiots, and brutes acquire by habit many perceptions which they had not originally. Almost every employment in life hath perceptions of this kind that are peculiar to it. The shepherd knows every sheep of his flock, as we do our acquaintance, and can pick them out of another flock one by one. The butcher knows by sight the weight and quality of his beeves and sheep before they are killed. The farmer perceives by his eye very nearly the quantity of hay in a rick, or of corn in a heap. The sailor sees the burden, the built, and the distance of a ship at sea, while she is a great way off. Every man accustomed to writing distinguishes his acquaintance by their handwriting, as he does by their faces, and the painter distinguishes in the works of his art the style of all the great masters. In a word, acquired perception is very different in different persons, according to the diversity of objects about which they are employed, and the application they bestow in observing them. Perception ought not only to be distinguished from sensation, but likewise from that knowledge of objects of sense which is got by reasoning. There is no reasoning in perception, as hath been observed. The belief which is implied in it is the effect of instinct. But there are many things with regard to sensible objects which we can infer from what we perceive, and such conclusions of reason ought to be distinguished from what is merely perceived. When I look at the moon, I perceive her to be sometimes circular, sometimes horned, and sometimes gibbous. This is simple perception, and is the same in the philosopher and in the clown. But from these various appearances of her enlightened part, I infer that she is really of a spherical figure. This conclusion is not obtained by simple perception, but by reasoning. Simple perception has the same relation to the conclusions of reason drawn from our perceptions as the axioms in mathematics have to the propositions. I cannot demonstrate that two quantities which are equal to the same quantity are equal to each other. Neither can I demonstrate that the tree which I perceive exists. But by the constitution of my nature, my belief is irresistibly carried along by my apprehension of the axiom, and by the constitution of my nature. My belief is no less irresistibly carried along by my perception of the tree. All reasoning is from principles. The first principles of mathematical reasoning are mathematical axioms and definitions, and the first principles of all our reasoning about existences are our perceptions. The first principles of every kind of reasoning are given us by nature, and are of equal authority with the faculty of reason itself, which is also the gift of nature. The conclusions of reason are all built upon first principles, and can have no other foundation. Most justly, therefore, do such principles disdain to be tried by reason, and laugh at all the artillery of the logician when it is directed against them. When a long train of reasoning is necessary in demonstrating a mathematical proposition, it is easily distinguished from an axiom, and they seem to be things of a very different nature. But there are some propositions which lie so near to axioms that it is difficult to say whether they ought to be held as axioms or demonstrated as propositions. The same thing holds with regard to perception, and the conclusions drawn from it. Some of these conclusions follow our perceptions so easily, and are so immediately connected with them, that it is difficult to fix the limit which divides the one from the other. Perception, whether original or acquired, implies no exercise of reason, and is common to men, children, idiots, and brutes. The more obvious conclusions drawn from our perceptions by reason make what we call common understanding, by which men conduct themselves in the common affairs of life, and by which they are distinguished from idiots. The more remote conclusions, which are drawn from our perceptions by reason, make what we commonly call science, in the various parts of nature, whether in agriculture, medicine, mechanics, or in any part of natural philosophy. When I see a garden in good order, containing a great variety of things of the best kinds, and in the most flourishing condition, I immediately conclude from these signs the skill and industry of the gardener. A farmer, when he rises in the morning, and perceives that the neighbouring brook overflows his field, concludes that a great deal of rain hath fallen in the night. Perceiving his fence broken and his corn trodden down, he concludes that some of his own or his neighbour's cattle have broke loose. Perceiving that his stable door is broke open, and some of his horses gone, he concludes that a thief has carried them off. He traces the prints of his horse's feet in the soft ground, and by them discovers which road the thief hath taken. There are instances of common understanding which dwells so near to perception that it is difficult to trace the line which divides the one from the other. In like manner, the science of nature dwells so near to common understanding that we cannot discern where the latter ends and the former begins. I perceive that bodies, lighter than water, swim in water, and that those which are heavier sink. Hence I conclude that if a body remains, wherever it is put under water, whether at the top or bottom, it is precisely of the same weight with water. If it will rest only when part of it is above water, it is lighter than water. And the greater the part above water is compared with the whole, the lighter is the body. If it had no gravity at all, it would make no impression upon the water, but stand wholly above it. Thus every man by common understanding has a rule by which he judges of the specific gravity of bodies which swim in water, and a step or two more leads him into the science of hydrostatics. All that we know of nature, or of existence, may be compared to a tree which have its root, trunk, and branches. In this tree of knowledge, perception is the root, common understanding is the trunk, and the sciences are the branches. End of Chapter 6, Part 5. Recording by Stephen Reynolds, Durham, Connecticut.
Chapter 6, Part 6 of an Inquiry into the Human Mind on the Principles of Common Sense. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by K. Hand. An Inquiry into the Human Mind on the Principles of Common Sense by Thomas Reid. Chapter 6, Part 6. Section 21. Of the process of nature in perception. Although there is no reasoning in perception, yet there are certain means and instruments which, by the appointment of nature, must intervene between the object and our perception of it, and by these our perceptions are limited and regulated. First, if the object is not in contact with the organ of sense, there must be some medium which passes between them. Thus in vision, the rays of light; in hearing, the vibrations of elastic air; in smelling, the effluvia of the body smelled, must pass from the object to the organ, otherwise we have no perception. Secondly, there must be some action or impression upon the organ of sense, either by the immediate application of the object, or by the medium that goes between them. Thirdly, the nerves which go from the brain to the organ must receive some impression by means of that which was made upon the organ, and probably, by means of the nerves, some impression must be made upon the brain. Fourthly, the impression made upon the organ, nerves, and brain is followed by a sensation. And last of all, this sensation is followed by the perception of the object. Thus our perception of objects is the result of a train of operations, some of which affect the body only, others affect the mind. We know very little of the nature of some of these operations. We know not at all how they are connected together, or in what way they contribute to the perception which is the result of the whole. But, by the laws of our constitution, we perceive objects in this, and in no other way. There may be other beings who can perceive external objects without rays of light, or vibrations of air, or effluvia of bodies, without impressions on bodily organs, or even without sensations. But we are so framed by the Author of nature that even when we are surrounded by external objects, we may perceive none of them. Our faculty of perceiving an object lies dormant until it is roused and stimulated by a certain corresponding sensation. Nor is this sensation always at hand to perform its office, for it enters into the mind only in consequence of a certain corresponding impression made on the organ of sense by the object. Let us trace this correspondence of impressions, sensations, and perceptions as far as we can, beginning with that which is first in order, the impression made upon the bodily organ. But alas, we know not of what nature these impressions are, far less how they excite sensations in the mind. We know that one body may act upon another by pressure, by percussion, by attraction, by repulsion, and probably in many other ways which we neither know nor have names to express. But in which of these ways objects, when perceived by us, act upon the organs of sense, these organs upon the nerves, and the nerves upon the brain, we know not. Can any man tell me how, in vision, the rays of light act upon the retina, how the retina acts upon the optic nerve, and how the optic nerve acts upon the brain? No man can. When I feel the pain of the gout in my toe, I know that there is some unusual impression made upon that part of my body. But of what kind is it? Are the small vessels distended with some redundant elastic or unelastic fluid? Are the fibers unusually stretched? Are they torn asunder by force, or gnawed and corroded by some acrid humor? I can answer none of these questions. All that I feel is pain, which is not an impression upon the body but upon the mind, and all that I perceive by this sensation is, that some distemper in my toe occasions this pain. But as I know not the natural temper and texture of my toe when it is at ease, I know as little what change or disorder of its parts occasions this uneasy sensation. In like manner, in every other sensation there is without a doubt some impression made upon the organ of sense, but an impression of which we know not the nature. It is too subtle to be discovered by our senses, and we may make 1,000 conjectures without coming near the truth. If we understood the structure of our organs of sense so minutely as to discover what effects are produced upon them by external objects, this knowledge would contribute nothing to our perception of the object, for they perceive as distinctly who know least about the manner of perception, as the greatest adepts. It is necessary that the impression be made upon our organs, but not that it be known. Nature carries on this part of the process of perception without our consciousness or concurrence. But we cannot be unconscious of the next step in this process, the sensation of the mind, which always immediately follows the impression made upon the body. It is essential to a sensation to be felt, and it can be nothing more than we feel it to be. If we can only acquire the habit of attending to our sensations, we may know them perfectly. But how are the sensations of the mind produced by impressions upon the body? Of this we are absolutely ignorant, having no means of knowing how the body acts upon the mind or the mind upon the body. When we consider the nature and attributes of both, they seem to be so different and so unlike that we can find no handle by which the one may lay hold of the other. There is a deep and dark gulf between them which our understanding cannot pass, and the manner of their correspondence and intercourse is absolutely unknown. Experience teaches us that certain impressions upon the body are constantly followed by certain sensations of the mind, and that, on the other hand, certain determinations of the mind are constantly followed by certain motions in the body, but we see not the chain that ties these things together. Who knows but their connection may be arbitrary and owing to the will of our Maker? Perhaps the same sensations might have been connected with other impressions or other bodily organs. Perhaps we might have been so made as to taste with our fingers, to smell with our ears, and to hear by the nose. Perhaps we might have been so made as to have all the sensations and perceptions which we have, without any impression made upon our bodily organs at all. However these things may be, if nature had given us nothing more than impressions made upon the body, and sensations in our minds corresponding to them, we should in that case have been merely sentient, but not perceptient beings. We should never have been able to form a conception of any external object, far less a belief of its existence. Our sensations have no resemblance to external objects, nor can we discover by our reason any necessary connection between the existence of the former and that of the latter. We might perhaps have been made of such a constitution as to have our present perceptions connected with other sensations. We might perhaps have had the perception of external objects without either impressions upon the organs of sense or sensations. Or lastly, the perceptions we have might have been immediately connected with the impressions upon our organs without any intervention of sensations. This last seems really to be the case in one instance, to wit, in our perception of the visible figure of bodies, as was observed in the 8th section of this chapter. The process of nature in perception by the senses may therefore be conceived as a kind of drama, wherein some things are performed behind the scenes, others are represented to the mind in different scenes, one succeeding another. The impression made by the object upon the organ, either by immediate contact or by some intervening medium, as well as the impression made upon the nerves and the brain, is performed behind the scenes, and the mind sees nothing of it. But every such impression, by the laws of the drama, is followed by a sensation, which is the first scene exhibited to the mind. And this scene is quickly succeeded by another, which is the perception of the object. In this drama, nature is the actor, we are the spectators. We know nothing of the machinery by means of which every different impression upon the organ, nerves, and brain exhibits its corresponding sensation, or of the machinery by means of which each sensation exhibits its corresponding perception. We are inspired with the sensation, and we are inspired with the corresponding perception, by means unknown. And because the mind passes immediately from the sensation to that conception and belief of the object which we have in perception, in the same manner as it passes from signs to the things signified by them, we have therefore called our sensations signs of external objects, finding no word more proper to express the function which nature hath assigned them in perception, and the relation which they bear to their corresponding objects. There is no necessity of a resemblance between the sign and the thing signified, and indeed no sensation can resemble any external object. But there are two things necessary to our knowing things by means of signs. First, that a real connection between the sign and the thing signified be established, either by the course of nature or by the will and appointment of men. When they are connected by the course of nature, it is a natural sign. When by human appointment, it is an artificial sign. Thus, smoke is a natural sign of fire. Certain features are natural signs of anger, but our words, whether expressed by articulate sounds or by writing, are artificial signs of our thoughts and purposes. Another requisite to our knowing things by signs is that the appearance of the sign to the mind be followed by the conception and belief of the thing signified. Without this, the sign is not understood or interpreted, and therefore is no sign to us, however fit in its own nature for that purpose. Now, there are three ways in which the mind passes from the appearance of a natural sign to the conception and belief of the thing signified: by original principles of our constitution, by custom, and by reasoning. Our original perceptions are got in the first of these ways, our acquired perceptions in the second, and all that reason discovers of the course of nature in the third. In the first of these ways, nature, by means of the sensations of touch, informs us of the hardness and softness of bodies, of their extension, figure, and motion, and of that space in which they move and are placed, as hath been already explained in the 5th chapter of this inquiry. And in the second of these ways, she informs us, by means of our eyes, of almost all the same things which originally we could perceive only by touch. In order therefore to understand more particularly how we learn to perceive so many things by the eye, which originally could be perceived only by touch, it will be proper first to point out the signs by which those things are exhibited to the eye, and their connection with the things signified by them; and secondly, to consider how the experience of this connection produces that habit by which the mind, without any reasoning or reflection, passes from the sign to the conception and belief of the thing signified. Of all the acquired perceptions which we have by sight, the most remarkable is the perception of the distance of objects from the eye. We shall therefore particularly consider the signs by which this perception is exhibited, and only make some general remarks with regard to the signs which are used in other acquired perceptions. Section 22. Of the signs by which we learn to perceive distance from the eye. It was before observed in general that the original perceptions of sight are signs which serve to introduce those that are acquired, but this is not to be understood as if no other signs were employed for that purpose. There are several motions of the eyes, which, in order to distinct vision, must be varied, according as the object is more or less distant, and such motions being by habit connected with the corresponding distances of the object, become signs of those distances. These motions were at first voluntary and unconfined, but as the intention of nature was, to produce perfect and distinct vision by their means, we soon learn by experience to regulate them according to that intention only, without the least reflection. A ship requires a different trim for every variation of the direction and strength of the wind; and if we may be allowed to borrow that word, the eyes require a different trim for every degree of light, and for every variation of the distance of the object, while it is within certain limits. The eyes are trimmed for a particular object, by contracting certain muscles and relaxing others, as the ship is trimmed for a particular wind, by drawing certain ropes and slackening others. The sailor learns the trim of his ship, as we learn the trim of our eyes, by experience. A ship, although the noblest machine that human art can boast, is far inferior to the eye in this respect, that it requires art and ingenuity to navigate her, and a sailor must know what ropes he must pull and what he must slacken, to fit her to a particular wind. But with such superior wisdom is the fabric of the eye, and the principles of its motion contrived, that it requires no art nor ingenuity to see by it. Even that part of vision which is got by experience is attained by idiots. We need not know what muscles we are to contract, and what we are to relax, in order to fit the eye to a particular distance of the object. But although we are not conscious of the motions we perform, in order to fit the eyes to the distance of the object, we are conscious of the effort employed in producing these motions, and probably have some sensation which accompanies them, to which we give as little attention as to other sensations. And thus an effort consciously exerted, or a sensation consequent upon that effort, comes to be conjoined with the distance of the object which gave occasion to it, and by this conjunction becomes a sign of that distance. Some instances of this will appear in considering the means or signs by which we learn to see the distance of objects from the eye. In the enumeration of these we agree with Dr. Porterfield, notwithstanding that distance from the eye, in his opinion, is perceived originally, but in our opinion, by experience only. In general, when a near object affects the eye in one manner, and the same object, placed at a greater distance, affects it in a different manner, these various affectations of the eye become signs of the corresponding distances. The means of perceiving distance by the eye will therefore be explained by shewing in what various ways objects affect the eye differently, according to their proximity or distance. 1. It is well known that to see objects distinctly at various distances the form of the eye must undergo some change. And nature hath given us the power of adapting it to near objects, by the contraction of certain muscles, and to distant objects, by the contraction of other muscles. As to the manner in which this is done, and the muscular parts employed, anatomists do not altogether agree. The ingenious Dr. Jurin, in his excellent essay on distinct and indistinct vision, seems to have given the most probable account of this matter, and to him I refer the reader. But whatever be the manner in which this change of the form of the eye is effected, it is certain that young people have commonly the power of adapting their eyes to all distances of the object, from 6 to 7 inches, to 15 or 16 feet, so as to have perfect and distinct vision at any distance within these limits. From this it follows that the effect we consciously employ to adapt the eye to any particular distance of objects within these limits will be connected and associated with that distance, and will become a sign of it. When the object is removed beyond the farthest limit of distinct vision, it will be seen indistinctly, but more or less so, according as its distance is greater or less, so that the degrees of indistinctness of the object may become the signs of distances considerably beyond the farthest limit of distinct vision. If we had no other means but this, of perceiving distance of visible objects, the most distant would not appear to be above 20 or 30 feet from the eye, and the tops of houses and trees would seem to touch the clouds. For in that case, the signs of all greater distances being the same, they have the same signification, and give the same perception of distance. But it is of more importance to observe, that because the nearest limit of distinct vision in the time of youth, when we learn to perceive distance by the eye, is about 6 or 7 inches, no object seen distinctly ever appears to be nearer than 6 or 7 inches from the eye. We can by art make a small object appear distinct, when it is in reality not above half an inch from the eye, either by using a single microscope, or by looking through a small pinhole in a card. When by either of these means an object is made to appear distinct, however small its distance is in reality, it seems to be removed at least to the distance of 6 or 7 inches, that is, within the limits of distinct vision. This observation is the more important because it affords the only reason we can give why an object is magnified either by a single microscope or by being seen through a pinhole, and the only mean by which we can ascertain the degree in which the object will be magnified by either. Thus, if the object is really half an inch distant from the eye and appears to be 7 inches distant, its diameter will seem to be enlarged in the same proportion as its distance, that is, 14 times. 2. In order to direct both eyes to an object, the optic axis must have a greater or less inclination, according as the object is nearer or more distant. And although we are not conscious of this inclination, yet we are conscious of the effort employed in it. By this mean we perceive small distances more accurately than we could do by the conformation of the eye only. And therefore we find that those who have lost the sight of one eye are apt, even within arm's length, to make mistakes in the distance of objects, which are easily avoided by those who see with both eyes. Such mistakes are often discovered in snuffing a candle, in threading a needle, or in filling a teacup. When a picture is seen with both eyes and at no great distance, the representation appears not so natural as when it is seen only with one. The intention of painting being to deceive the eye, and to make things appear at different distances which in reality are upon the same piece of canvas, this deception is not so easily put upon both eyes as upon one, because we perceive the distance of visible objects more exactly and determinately with two eyes than with one. If the shading and relief be executed in the best manner, the picture may have almost the same appearance to one eye as objects themselves would have, but it cannot have the same appearance to both. This is not the fault of the artist, but an unavoidable imperfection in the art. And it is owing to what we have just now observed, that the perception we have of the distance of objects by one eye is more uncertain, and more liable to deception than that which we have by both. The great impediment, and I think the only invincible impediment, to the agreeable deception of the eye which the painter aims at, is a perception which we have of the distance of visible objects from the eye, partly by means of the conformation of the eye, but chiefly by means of the inclination of the optic axes. If this perception could be removed, I see no reason why a picture might not be made so perfect as to deceive the eye in reality, and to be mistaken for the original object. Therefore, in order to judge of the merit of a picture, we ought, as much as possible, to exclude these two means of perceiving the distance of the several parts of it. In order to remove this perception of distance, the connoisseurs in painting use a method which is very proper. They look at the picture with one eye, through a tube which excludes the view of all other objects. By this method, the principal mean whereby we perceive the distance of the object, to wit, the inclination of the optic axes, is entirely excluded. I would humbly propose, as an improvement of this method of viewing pictures, that the aperture of the tube next to the eye should be very small. If it is as small as a pinhole, so much the better, providing there be light enough to see the picture clearly. The reason of this proposal is that, when we look at an object through a small aperture, it will be seen distinctly, whether the conformation of the eye be adapted to its distance or not, and we have no means left to judge of the distance, but the light and colouring, which are in the painter's power. If, therefore, the artist performs his part properly, the picture will by this method affect the eye in the same manner that the object represented would do, which is the perfection of this art. Although the second mean of perceiving the distance of visible objects be more determinate and exact than the first, yet it hath its limits beyond which it can be of no use. For when the optic axes directed to an object are so nearly parallel, that in directing them to an object yet more distant, we are not conscious of any new effort, nor have any different sensation, there our perception of distance stops, and as all more distant objects affect the eye in the same manner, we perceive them to be at the same distance. This is the reason why the sun, moon, planets, and fixed stars, when seen not near the horizon, appear to be all at the same distance, as if they touched the concave surface of a great sphere. The surface of this celestial sphere is at that distance beyond which all objects affect the eye in the same manner. Why this celestial vault appears more distant towards the horizon than towards the zenith will afterwards appear. 3. The colours of objects, according as they are more distant, become more faint and languid, and are tinged more with the azure of the intervening atmosphere. To this we may add, that their minute parts become more indistinct, and their outline less accurately defined. It is by these means chiefly that the painters can represent objects at very different distances upon the same canvas. And the diminution of the magnitude of an object would not have the effect of making it appear to be at a great distance without this degradation of colour, and indistinctness of the outline, and of the minute parts. If a painter should make a human figure 10 times less than other human figures that are in the same piece, having the colours as bright and the outline and minute parts as accurately defined, it would not have the appearance of a man at a great distance, but of a pygmy or Lilliputian. When an object hath a known variety of colours, its distance is more clearly indicated by the gradual dilution of the colours into one another, than when it is of one uniform colour. In the steeple which stands before me at a small distance, the joinings of the stones are clearly perceptible, the grey colour of the stone and the white cement are distinctly limited. When I see it at a greater distance, the joinings of the stones are less distinct, and the colours of the stone and of the cement begin to dilute into one another. At a distance still greater, the joinings disappear altogether, and the variety of colour vanishes. In an apple tree which stands at the distance of about 12 feet, covered with flowers, I can perceive the figure and the colour of the leaves and petals, pieces of branches, some larger, others smaller, peeping through the interval of the leaves, some of them enlightened by the sun's rays, others shaded, and some openings of the sky are perceived through the whole. When I gradually remove from this tree, the appearance, even as to the colour, changes every minute. First the smaller parts, then the larger, are gradually confounded and mixed. The colors of the leaves, petals, branches, and sky are gradually diluted into each other, and the color of the whole becomes more and more uniform. This change of appearance, corresponding to the several distances, marks the distance more exactly than if the whole object had been of one color. Dr. Smith, in his Optics, gives us a very curious observation made by Bishop Berkeley in his travels through Italy and Sicily. He observed that in those countries, cities and palaces seen at a great distance appeared nearer to him by several miles than they really were, and he very judiciously imputed it to this cause, that the purity of the Italian and Sicilian air gave to very distant objects that degree of brightness and distinctness which, in the grosser air of his own country, was to be seen only in those that are near. The purity of the Italian air has been assigned as the reason why the Italian painters commonly give a more lively colour to the sky than the Flemish. Ought they not, for the same reason, to give less degradation of the colours, and less indistinctness of the minute parts in the representation of very distant objects? It is very certain that as, in air uncommonly pure, we are apt to think visible objects nearer, and less than they really are, so, in air uncommonly foggy, we are apt to think them more distant, and larger than the truth. Walking by the seaside in a thick fog, I see an object which seems to me to be a man on horseback, and at the distance of about half a mile. My companion, who has better eyes, or is more accustomed to see such objects in such circumstances, assures me that it is a seagull, and not a man on horseback. Upon a second view I immediately assent to his opinion, and now it appears to me to be a seagull, and at a distance of only 70 or 80 yards. The mistake made on this occasion and the correction of it are both so sudden that we are at a loss whether to call them by the name of judgment, or by that of simple perception. It is not worth while to dispute about names, but it is evident that my belief, both first and last, was produced rather by signs than by arguments, and that the mind proceeded to the conclusion in both cases by habit, and not by ratiocination. And the process of the mind seems to have been this: first, not knowing or not minding the effect of a foggy air on the visible appearance of objects, the object seems to me to have that degradation of colour, and that indistinctness of the outline, which objects have at the distance of half a mile. Therefore, from the visible appearance as a sign, I immediately proceed to the belief that the object is half a mile distant. Then this distance, together with the visible magnitude, signify to me the real magnitude, which, supposing the distance to be half a mile, must be equal to that of a man on horseback. And the figure, considering the indistinctness of the outline, agrees with that of a man on horseback. Thus the deception is brought about. But when I am assured that it is a seagull, the real magnitude of a seagull, together with the visible magnitude presented to the eye, immediately suggests the distance, which in this case cannot be above 70 or 80 yards. The indistinctness of the figure likewise suggests the fogginess of the air as its cause, and now the whole chain of signs and things signified seems stronger and better connected than it was before. The half-mile vanishes to 80 yards, the man on horseback dwindles to a seagull. I get a new perception, and wonder how I got the former, or what has become of it, for it is now so entirely gone that I cannot recover it. It ought to be observed that in order to produce such deceptions from the clearness or fogginess of the air, it must be uncommonly clear or uncommonly foggy. For we learn from experience to make allowance for that variety of constitutions of the air which we have been accustomed to observe, and of which we are aware. Bishop Berkeley therefore committed a mistake when he attributed the large appearance of the horizontal moon to the faintness of her light, occasioned by its passing through a larger tract of atmosphere. For we are so much accustomed to see the moon in all degrees of faintness and brightness, from the greatest to the least, that we learn to make allowance for it, and do not imagine her magnitude increased by the faintness of her appearance. Besides, it is certain that the horizontal moon, seen through a tube which cuts off the view of the adjacent ground, and of all terrestrial objects, loses all that unusual appearance of magnitude. 4. We frequently perceive the distance of objects by means of intervening or contiguous objects whose distance or magnitude is otherwise known. When I perceive certain fields or tracts of ground to lie between me and an object, it is evident that these may become signs of its distance. And although we have no particular information of the dimensions of such fields or tracts, yet their similitude to others which we know suggests their dimensions. We are so much accustomed to measure with our eye the ground which we travel, and to compare the judgments of distances formed by sight with our experience or information, that we learn by degrees in this way to form a more accurate judgment of the distance of terrestrial objects than we could do by any of the means before mentioned. An object placed upon the top of a high building appears much less than when placed upon the ground at the same distance. When it stands upon the ground, the intervening tract of ground serves as a sign of its distance, and the distance, together with the visible magnitude, serves as a sign of its real magnitude. But when the object is placed on high, this sign of its distance is taken away. The remaining signs lead us to place it at a less distance, and this less distance together with the visible magnitude becomes a sign of a real less magnitude. The first two means we have mentioned would never of themselves make a visible object appear above 150 or 200 feet distant, because beyond that there is no sensible change either of the conformation of the eyes or of the inclination of their axes. The third mean is but a vague and undeterminate sign, when applied to distances above 200 or 300 feet, unless we know the real color and figure of the object. And the fifth mean, to be afterwards mentioned, can only be applied to objects which are familiar, or whose real magnitude is known. Hence it follows that when unknown objects upon or near the surface of the earth are perceived to be at the distance of some miles, it is always by this fourth mean that we are led to that conclusion. Dr. Smith hath observed very justly, that the known distance of the terrestrial objects which terminate our view, makes that part of the sky which is towards the horizon appear more distant than that which is toward the zenith. Hence it comes to pass, that the apparent figure of the sky is not that of a hemisphere, but rather a less segment of a sphere. And hence likewise it comes to pass that the diameter of the sun or moon, or the distance between two fixed stars, seen contiguous to a hill, or to any distant terrestrial object, appears much greater than when no such object strikes the eye at the same time. These observations have been sufficiently explained and confirmed by Dr. Smith. I beg leave to add, that when the visible horizon is terminated by very distant objects, the celestial vault seems to be enlarged in all its dimensions. When I view it from a confined street or lane, it bears some proportion to the buildings that surround me. But when I view it from a large plain, terminated on all hands by hills which rise one above another, to the distance of 20 miles from the eye, methinks I see a new heaven, whose magnificence declares the greatness of its author, and puts every human edifice at a countenance. For now the lofty spires and the gorgeous palaces shrink into nothing before it, and bear no more proportion to the celestial dome than their makers bear to its maker. 5. There remains another mean by which we perceive the distance of visible objects, and that is the diminution of their visible or apparent magnitude. By experience I know what figure a man, or any other known object, makes to my eye at the distance of 10 feet. I perceive the gradual and proportional diminution of this visible figure at the distance of 20, 40, 100 feet, and at greater distances, until it vanish altogether. Hence a certain visible magnitude of a known object becomes the sign of a certain determinate distance, and carries along with it the conception and belief of that distance. In this process of the mind, the sign is not a sensation, it is an original perception. We perceive the visible figure and visible magnitude of the object by the original powers of vision, but the visible figure is used only as a sign of the real figure, and the visible magnitude is used only as a sign of either the distance or of the real magnitude of the object, and therefore these original perceptions, like other mere signs, pass through the mind without any attention or reflection. This last mean of perceiving the distance of known objects serves to explain some very remarkable phenomena in optics, which would otherwise appear very mysterious. When we view objects of known dimensions through optical glasses, there is no other mean left of determining their distance, but this fifth. Hence it follows that known objects seen through glasses must seem to be brought nearer, in proportion to the magnifying power of the glass, or to be removed to a greater distance, in proportion to the diminishing power of the glass. If a man who had never before seen objects through a telescope were told that the telescope which he is about to use magnifies the diameter of the object 10 times, when he looks through this telescope at a man 6 feet high, what would he expect to see? Surely he would very naturally expect to see a giant 60 feet high. But he sees no such thing. The man appears no more than 6 feet high, and consequently no bigger than he really is, but he appears 10 times nearer than he is. The telescope indeed magnifies the image of this man upon the retina 10 times in diameter, and must therefore magnify his visible figure in the same proportion. And as we have been accustomed to see him of this visible magnitude, when he was 10 times nearer than he is presently, and in no other case, this visible magnitude therefore suggests the conception and belief of that distance of the object with which it hath been always connected. We have been accustomed to conceive this amplification of the visible figure of a known object only as the effect or sign of its being brought nearer, and we have annexed a certain determinate distance to every degree of visible magnitude of the object, and therefore any particular degree of visible magnitude, whether seen by the naked eye or by glasses, brings along with it the conception and belief of the distance which corresponds to it. This is the reason why a telescope seems not to magnify known objects, but to bring them nearer to the eye. When we look through a pinhole or a single microscope at an object which is half an inch from the eye, the picture of the object upon the retina is not enlarged, but only rendered distinct. Neither is the visible figure enlarged, yet the object appears to the eye 12 or 14 times more distant, and as many times larger in diameter than it really is. Such a telescope we have mentioned amplifies the image on the retina, and the visible figure of the object 10 times in diameter, and yet makes it seem no bigger, but only 10 times nearer. These appearances had been long observed by writers on optics. They tortured their invention to find the causes of them from optical principles, but in vain. They must be resolved into habits of perception, which are acquired by custom, but are apt to be mistaken for original perceptions. The Bishop of Cloyne first furnished the world with a proper key for opening up these mysterious appearances, but he made considerable mistakes in the application of it. Dr. Smith, in his elaborate and judicious treatise of optics, hath applied it to the apparent distance of objects seen with glasses, and to the apparent figure of the heavens, with such happy success that there can be no more doubt about the causes of these phenomena. Section 23. Of the signs used in other acquired perceptions. The distance of objects from the eye is the most important lesson in vision. Many others are easily learned in consequence of it. The distance of the object, joined with its visible magnitude, is a sign of its real magnitude, and the distance of the several parts of an object, joined with its visible figure, becomes a sign of its real figure. Thus, when I look at a globe which stands before me, by the original powers of sight I perceive only something of a circular form, variously colored. The visible figure hath no distance from the eye, no convexity, nor hath it 3 dimensions. Even its length and breadth are incapable of being measured by inches, feet, or other linear measures. But when I have learned to perceive the distance of every part of this object from the eye, this perception gives it convexity, and a spherical figure, and adds a 3rd dimension to that which had but 2 before. The distance of the whole object makes me likewise perceive the real magnitude, for being accustomed to observe how an inch or a foot of length affects the eye at that distance, I plainly perceive by my eye the linear dimensions of the globe, and can affirm with certainty that its diameter is about 1 foot and 3 inches. It was shewn in the 7th section of this chapter that the visible figure of a body may, by mathematical reasoning, be inferred from its real figure, distance, and position with regard to the eye. In like manner we may, by mathematical reasoning, from the visible figure, together with the distance of the several parts of it from the eye, infer the real figure and position. But this last inference is not commonly made by mathematical reasoning, nor indeed by reasoning of any kind, but by custom. The original appearance which the color of an object makes to the eye is a sensation for which we have no name, because it is used merely as a sign, and is never made an object of attention in common life. But this appearance, according to the different circumstances, signifies various things. If a piece of cloth of one uniform color is laid so that part of it is in the sun and part in the shade, the appearance of color in these different parts is very different, yet we perceive the color to be the same. We interpret the variety of appearance as a sign of light and shade, and not as a sign of real difference in color. But if the eye could be so far deceived as not to perceive the difference of light in the 2 parts of the cloth, we should in that case interpret the variety of appearance to signify a variety of color in the parts of the cloth. Again, if we suppose a piece of cloth placed as before, but having the shaded part so much brighter in the color that it gives the same appearance to the eye as the more enlightened part, the sameness of appearance will here be interpreted to signify a variety of color, because we shall make allowance for the effect of light and shade. When the real color of an object is known, the appearance of it indicates, in some circumstances, the degree of light or shade. In others, the color of the circumambient bodies, whose rays are reflected by it. In other circumstances it indicates the distance or proximity of the object, as was observed in the last section. And by means of these many other things are suggested to the mind. Thus, an unusual appearance in the color of familiar objects may be diagnostic of a disease in the spectator. The appearance of things in my room may indicate sunshine or cloudy weather, the earth covered with snow, or blackened with rain. It hath been observed that the color of the sky in a piece of painting may indicate the country of the painter, because the Italian sky is really of a different color from the Flemish. It was already observed that the original and acquired perceptions which we have by our senses are the language of nature to men, which, in many respects, has great affinity to human languages. The instances which we have given of acquired perceptions suggest this affinity, that as in human languages ambiguities are often found, so this language of nature, in our acquired perception, is not exempted from them. We have seen, in vision particularly, that the same appearance to the eye may, in different circumstances, indicate different things. Therefore, when the circumstances are unknown upon which the interpretation of the signs depends, their meaning must be ambiguous, and when the circumstances are mistaken, the meaning of the signs must also be mistaken. This is the case in all phenomena which we call fallacies of the senses, and particularly in those which are called fallacies in vision. The appearance of things to the eye always corresponds to the fixed laws of nature. Therefore, if we speak properly, there is no fallacy in the senses. Nature always speaketh the same language, and useth the same signs in the same circumstances. But we sometimes mistake the meanings of the signs, either through ignorance of the laws of nature, or through ignorance of the circumstances which attend the signs. To a man unacquainted with the principles of optics, almost every experiment that is made with the prism, with the magic lanthorn, with the telescope, with the microscope, seems to produce some fallacy in vision. Even the appearance of a common mirror, to one altogether unacquainted with the effects of it, would seem most remarkably fallacious. For, how can a man be more imposed upon than in seeing that before him which is really behind him? How can he be more imposed upon than in being made to see himself several yards removed from himself? Yet children, even before they can speak their mother tongue, learn not to be deceived by these appearances. These, as well as the other surprising appearances produced by optical glasses, are a part of the visual language, and to those who understand the laws of nature concerning light and colors, are in no wise fallacious, but have a distinct and true meaning. End of Chapter 6, Part 6. Chapter 6, Part 7 of An Inquiry into the Human Mind on the Principles of Common Sense. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by K. Hand. An Inquiry into the Human Mind on the Principles of Common Sense by Thomas Reid. Chapter 6, Part 7. Section 24. Of the Analogy between Perception and the Credit we give to Human Testimony. The objects of human knowledge are innumerable, but the channels by which it is conveyed to the mind are few. Among these, the perception of external things by our senses, and the informations which we receive upon human testimony, are not the least considerable; and so remarkable is the analogy between these two, and the analogy between the principles of the mind, which are subservient to the one, and those which are subservient to the other, without further apology, we shall consider them together. In the testimony of nature given by the senses, as well as in human testimony given by language, things are signified to us by signs, and in one, as well as the other, the mind, either by the original principles or by custom, passes from the sign to the conception and belief of the thing signified. We have distinguished our perceptions into original and acquired, and language into natural and artificial. Between acquired perception and artificial language there is a great analogy, but still a greater between original perception and natural language. The signs in original perception are sensations of which nature hath given us a great variety, suited to the variety of the things signified by them. Nature hath established a real connection between the signs and the things signified, and nature hath also taught us the interpretation of the signs, so that, previous to experience, the sign suggests the thing signified, and creates the belief of it. The signs in natural language are features of the face, gestures of the body, and modulations of the voice, the variety of which is suited to the variety of the things signified by them. Nature hath established a real connection between these signs and the thoughts and dispositions of the mind which are signified by them, and nature hath taught us the interpretation of the signs, so that, previous to experience, the signs suggest the thing signified, and create the belief of it. A man in company, without doing good or evil, without uttering an articulate sound, may behave himself gracefully, civilly, politely, or, on the contrary, meanly, rudely, and impertinently. We see the dispositions of his mind by their natural signs in his countenance and behaviour, in the same manner as we perceive the figure and other qualities of bodies by which the sensations which nature hath connected with them. The signs in the natural language of the human countenance and behavior, as well as the signs in our original perceptions, have the same signification in all climates, and in all nations, and the skill of interpreting them is not acquired but innate. In acquired perception, the signs are either sensations, or things which we perceive by means of sensations. The connection between the sign and the thing signified is established by nature, and we discover this connection by experience, but not without the aid of our original perceptions, or of those which we have already acquired. After this connection is discovered, the sign, in like manner as in original perception, always suggests the thing signified and creates the belief of it. In artificial language, the signs are articulate sounds, whose connection with the thing signified by them is established by the will of men, and in learning our mother tongue we discover this connection by experience, but not without the aid of natural language, or of what we had before attained of artificial language. And after this connection is discovered, the sign, as in natural language, always suggests the thing signified and creates the belief of it. Our original perceptions are few, compared with the acquired, but without the former we could not possibly attain the latter. In like manner, natural language is scanty, compared with artificial, but without the former we could not possibly attain the latter. Our original perceptions, as well as the natural language of human features and gestures, must be resolved into particular principles of the human constitution. Thus it is by one particular principle of our constitution that certain features express anger, and by another particular principle that certain features express benevolence. It is in like manner by one particular principle of our constitution that a certain sensation signifies hardness in the body which I handle, and it is by another particular principle that a certain sensation signifies motion in that body. But our acquired perceptions and the information we receive by means of artificial language must be resolved into general principles of the human constitution. When a painter perceives that this picture is the work of Raphael, that the work of Titian, a jeweler that this is a true diamond, that a counterfeit, a sailor that this is a ship of 500 ton, that of 400, these different acquired perceptions are produced by the same general principles of the human mind, which have a different operation in the same person, according as they are variously applied, and in different persons according to the diversity of their education and manner of life. In like manner, when certain articulate sounds convey to my mind the knowledge of the battle of Pharsalia, and others the knowledge of the battle of Pultola, when a Frenchman and an Englishman receive the same information by different articulate sounds, the signs used in these different cases produce the knowledge and belief of the thing signified, by the means of the same general principles of the human constitution. Now, if we compare the general principles of our constitution, which fit us for receiving information from our fellow creatures by language, with the general principles which fit us for acquiring the perception of things by our senses, we shall find them to be very similar in their nature and manner of operation. When we begin to learn our mother tongue, we perceive by the help of natural language that they who speak to us use certain sounds to express certain things. We imitate the same sounds when we would express the same things, and find that we are understood. But here a difficulty occurs which merits our attention, because the solution of it leads to some original principles of the human mind, which are of great importance and of very extensive influence. We know by experience that men have used such words to express things, but all experience is of the past, and can of itself give no notion or belief of what is future. How come we then to believe, and to rely upon it with assurance, that men who have it in their power to do otherwise will continue to use the same words when they think the same things? Whence comes this knowledge and belief, this foresight we ought rather to call it, of the future and voluntary actions of our fellow creatures? Have they promised that they will never impose upon us by equivocation or falsehood? No, they have not. And if they had, this would not solve the difficulty, for such promise must be expressed by words or by other signs, and before we can rely upon it, we must be assured that they put the usual meaning upon the signs which express that promise. No man of common sense ever thought of taking a man's own word for his honesty, and it is evident that we take his veracity for granted when we lay any stress upon his word or promise. I might add that this reliance upon the declarations and testimony of men is found in children long before they know what a promise is. There is, therefore, in the human mind an early anticipation, neither derived from experience, nor from reason, nor from any compact or promise, that our fellow creatures will use the same signs and language, when they have the same sentiment. This is in reality a kind of prescience of human actions, and it seems to me to be an original principle of the human constitution, without which we should be incapable of language, and consequently incapable of instruction. The wise and beneficent Author of nature, who intended that we should be social creatures, and that we should receive the greatest and most important part of our knowledge by the information of others, hath, for these purposes, implanted in our natures two principles that tally with each other. The first of these principles is a propensity to speak truth and to use the signs of language, so as to convey our real sentiments. This principle has a powerful operation, even in the greatest liars, for where they lie once, they speak truth 100 times. Truth is always uppermost, and is the natural issue of the mind. It requires no art or training, no inducement or temptation, but only that we yield to a natural impulse. Lying, on the contrary, is doing violence to our nature, and is never practiced, even by the worst men, without some temptation. Speaking truth is like using our natural food, which we would do from appetite, although it answered no end, but lying is like taking physic, which is nauseous to the taste, and which no man takes but for some end which he cannot otherwise attain. If it should be objected that men may be influenced by moral or political considerations to speak truth, and therefore that their doing so is no proof of such an original principle as we have mentioned, I answer first, that moral or political considerations can have no influence until we arrive at years of understanding and reflection. And it is certain from experience that children keep to truth invariably before they are capable of being influenced by such considerations. Secondly, when we are influenced by moral or political considerations, we must be conscious of that influence, and capable of perceiving it upon reflection. Now, when I reflect upon my actions most attentively, I am not conscious that, in speaking truth, I am influenced on ordinary occasions by any motive, moral or political. I find that truth is always at the door of my lips, and goes forth spontaneously if not held back. It requires neither good nor bad intention to bring it forth, but only that I be artless and undesigning. There may indeed be temptations to falsehood, which would be too strong for the natural principle of veracity, unaided by principles of honor or virtue. But where there is no such temptation, we speak truth by instinct, and this instinct is the principle I have been explaining. By this instinct a real connection is formed between our words and our thoughts, and thereby the former become fit to be signs of the latter, which they could not otherwise be. And although this connection is broken in every instance of lying and equivocation, yet these instances being comparatively few, the authority of human testimony is only weakened by them, but not destroyed. Another original principle implanted in us by the Supreme Being is a disposition to confide in the veracity of others, and to believe what they tell us. This is the counterpart to the former, and as that may be called the principle of veracity, we shall, for want of a more proper name, call this the principle of credulity. It is unlimited in children, until they meet with instances of deceit and falsehood, and it retains a very considerable degree of strength through life. If nature had left the mind of the speaker in equilibrio, without any inclination to the side of truth more than to that of falsehood, children would lie as often as they speak truth, until reason was so far ripened as to suggest the imprudence of lying, or conscience as to suggest its immorality. And if nature had left the mind of the hearer in equilibrio, without any inclination to the side of belief more than to that of disbelief, we should take no man's word until we had positive evidence that he spoke the truth. His testimony would, in this case, have no more authority than his dreams, which may be true or false, but no man is disposed to believe them on this account, that they were dreamed. It is evident that, in the matter of testimony, the balance of human judgment is by nature inclined to the side of belief, and turns to that side of itself, when there is nothing put to the opposite scale. If it was not so, no proposition that is uttered in discourse would be believed, until it was examined and tried by reason, and most men would be unable to find reasons for believing in the 1,000th part of what is told them. Such distrust and incredulity would deprive us of the greatest benefits of society, and place us in a worse condition than that of savages. Children, on this supposition, would be absolutely incredulous, and therefore absolutely incapable of instruction. Those who had little knowledge of human life, and of the manner and characters of men, would be in the next degree incredulous, and the most credulous men would be those of the greatest experience and of deepest penetration, because in many cases they would be able to find good reason for believing testimony which the weak and ignorant could not discover. In a word, if credulity were the effect of reasoning and experience, it must grow up and gather strength in the same proportion as reason and experience do. But, if it is the gift of nature, it will be strongest in childhood, and limited and restrained by experience. And the most superficial view of human life shews that the last is really the case, and not the first. It is the intention of nature that we should be carried in arms before we are able to walk upon our legs, and it is likewise the intention of nature that our belief should be guided by the authority and reason of others, before it can be guided by our own reason. The weakness of the infant and the natural affection of the mother plainly indicate the former, and the natural credulity of youth and authority of age as plainly indicate the latter. The infant, by proper nursing and care, acquires strength to walk without support. Reason hath likewise her infancy, when she must be carried in arms; then she leans entirely upon authority, by natural instinct, as if she was conscious of her own weakness, and without this support she becomes vertiginous. When brought to maturity by proper culture, she begins to feel her own strength, and leans less upon the reason of others. She learns to suspect testimony in some cases, and to disbelieve it in others, and sets bounds to that authority to which she was at first entirely subject. But still, to the end of life, she finds a necessity of borrowing light from testimony where she has none within herself, and of leaning in some degree upon the reason of others where she is conscious of her own imbecility. And as in many instances, reason, even in her maturity, borrows aid from testimony, so in others she mutually gives aid to it and strengthens its authority. For as we find good reason to reject testimony in some cases, so in others we find good reason to rely upon it with perfect security in our most important concerns. The character, the number, and the disinterestedness of witnesses, the impossibility of collusion, and the incredibility of their concurring in testimony without collusion, may give an irresistible strength to testimony, compared to which its native and intrinsic authority is very inconsiderable. Having now considered the general principles of the human mind which fit us for receiving information from our fellow creatures, by the means of language, let us next consider the general principles which fit us for receiving the information of nature by our acquired perceptions. It is undeniable, and indeed is acknowledged by all, that when we have found two things to have been constantly conjoined in the course of nature, the appearance of one of them is immediately followed by the conception and belief of the other. The former becomes the natural sign of the latter, and the knowledge of their constant conjunction in time past, whether got by experience or otherwise, is sufficient to make us rely with assurance upon the continuance of that conjunction. This process of the human mind is so familiar that we never think of inquiring into the principles on which it is founded. We are apt to conceive it as self-evident truth, that what is to come must be similar to what is past. Thus, if a certain degree of cold water freezes to-day, and has been known to do so in all time past, we have no doubt but the same degree of cold will freeze water to-morrow, or a year hence. That is a truth which all men believe as soon as they understand it, I readily admit. But the question is, whence does its evidence arise? Not from comparing the ideas, surely. For when I compare the idea of cold with that of water hardened into a transparent solid body, I can perceive no connection between them. No man can show the one to be the necessary effect of the other. No man can give a shadow of reason why nature hath conjoined them. But do we not learn their conjunction from experience? True. Experience informs us that they have been conjoined in time past. But no man ever had any experience as what is future. And this is the very question to be resolved: how we come to believe that the future will be like the past. Hath the author of nature promised this? Or were we admitted to his counsel when he established the present laws of nature and determined the time of their continuance? No, surely. Indeed, if we believe that there is a wise and good author of nature, we may see a good reason why he should continue the same laws of nature and the same connections of things for a long time. Because if he did otherwise, we could learn nothing from what is past, and all our experience would be of no use to us. But though this consideration, when we come to the use of reason, may confirm our belief of the continuance of the present course of nature, it is certain that it did not give rise to this belief, for children and idiots have this belief as soon as they know that fire will burn them. It must therefore be the effect of instinct, not of reason. The wise author of our nature intended that a great and necessary part of our knowledge should be derived from experience, before we are capable of reasoning, and he hath provided means perfectly adequate to this intention. For first, he governs nature by fixed laws, so that we find innumerable connections of things which continue from age to age. Without this stability of the course of nature there could be no experience, or it would be a false guide and lead us into error and mischief. If there were not a principle of veracity in the human mind, men's words would not be signs of their thoughts, and if there were no regularity in the course of nature, no one thing could be a natural sign of another. Secondly, he hath implanted in human minds an original principle by which we believe and expect the continuance of the course of nature, and the continuance of these connections which we have observed in times past. It is by this general principle of our nature that when two things have been found connected in time past, the appearance of the one produces the belief of the other. I think the ingenious author of the Treatise of Human Nature first observed, that our belief of the continuance of the laws of nature cannot be founded either upon knowledge or probability. But, far from conceiving it to be an original principle of the mind, he endeavours to account for it from his favourite hypothesis, that belief is nothing but a certain degree of vivacity in the idea of the thing believed. I made a remark upon this curious hypothesis in the second chapter, and shall now make another. The belief which we have in perception is a belief of the present existence of the object. That which we have in memory is a belief of its past existence. The belief of which we are now speaking is a belief of its future existence, and in imagination there is no belief at all. Now, I would gladly know of this author, how one degree of vivacity fixes the existence of the object to the present moment, another carries it back to time past, a third, taking a contrary direction, carries it into futurity, and a fourth carries it out of existence altogether. Suppose, for instance, that I see the sun rising out of the sea. I remember to have seen him rise yesterday. I believe he will rise tomorrow near the same place. I can likewise imagine him rising in that place without any belief at all. Now, according to this skeptical hypothesis, this perception, this memory, this foreknowledge, and this imagination are all the same idea, diversified only by different degrees of vivacity. The perception of the sun rising is the most lively idea. The memory of his rising yesterday is the same idea, a little more faint. The belief of his rising tomorrow is the same idea, yet fainter. And the imagination of his rising is still the same idea, but faintest of all. One is apt to think that this idea might gradually pass through all possible degrees of vivacity without stirring out of its place. But if we think so, we deceive ourselves, for no sooner does it begin to grow languid than it moves backwards into time past. Supposing this to be granted, we expect at least that as it moves backward by the decay of its vivacity, the more that vivacity decays, it will go back the farther, until it remove quite out of sight. But here we are deceived again, for there is a certain period of this declining vivacity, when, as if it had met an elastic obstacle in its motion backward, it suddenly rebounds from the past to the future without taking the present into its way. And now, having got into the regions of futurity, we are apt to think that it has room enough to spend all its remaining vigour. But still we are deceived, for by another sprightly bound, it mounts up into the airy region of imagination. So that ideas, in the gradual declination of their vivacity, seem to imitate the inflection of verbs in grammar. They begin with the present, and proceed in order to the preterite, the future, and the indefinite. This article of the Skeptical Creed is indeed so full of mystery, on whatever side we view it, that they who hold that creed are very injuriously charged with incredulity. For to me it appears to require as much faith as that of St. Athanasius. However, we agree with the author of the Treatise of Human Nature in this, that our belief of the continuance of nature's laws is not derived from reason. It is an instinctive prescience of the operations of nature, very like to that prescience of human actions which makes us rely upon the testimony of our fellow creatures. And as, without the latter, we should be incapable of receiving information from men by language, so, without the former, we should be incapable of receiving the information of nature by means of experience. All our knowledge of nature beyond our original perceptions is got by experience, and consists in the interpretation of natural signs. The constancy of nature's laws connects the sign with the thing signified, and by the natural principle just now explained, we rely upon the continuance of the connections which experience hath discovered, and thus the appearance of the sign is followed by the belief of the thing signified. Upon this principle of our constitution, not only acquired perception, but all inductive reasoning, and our reasoning from analogy, is grounded, and therefore, for want of another name, we shall beg leave to call it the inductive principle. It is from the force of this principle that we immediately assent to that axiom built upon which all our knowledge of nature is built, that effects of the same kind must have the same cause. For effects and causes in the operations of nature mean nothing but signs, and the things signified by them. We perceive no proper causality or efficiency in any natural cause, but only a connection established by the course of nature between it and what is called its effect. Antecedently to all reasoning, we have by our constitution an anticipation that there is a fixed and steady course of nature, and we have an eager desire to discover this course of nature. We attend to every conjunction of things which presents itself, and expect the continuance of that conjunction. And when such a conjunction has been often observed, we conceive the things to be naturally connected, and the appearance of one without any reasoning or reflection carries along with it the belief of the other. If any reader should imagine that the inductive principle may be resolved into what philosophers usually call the association of ideas, let him observe, natural signs are not associated with the idea only, but with the belief of the thing signified. Now, this can with no propriety be called an association of ideas, unless ideas and belief be one and the same thing. A child has found the prick of a pin conjoined with pain, hence he believes and knows that these things are naturally connected. He knows that the one will always follow the other. If any man will call this only an association of ideas, I dispute not about words, but I think he speaks very improperly. For if we express it in plain English, it is a prescience that things which he hath found conjoined in time past will be conjoined in time to come. And this prescience is not of the effect of reasoning, but of an original principle of human nature, which I have called the inductive principle. This principle, like that of credulity, is unlimited in infancy, and gradually restrained and regulated as we grow up. It leads us often into mistakes, but is of infinite advantage upon the whole. By it the child once burnt shuns the fire, and by it he likewise runs away from the surgeon by whom he was inoculated. It is better that he should do the last, than that he should not do the first. But the mistakes we are led into by these two natural principles are of a different kind. Men sometimes lead us into mistakes, when we perfectly understand their language, by speaking lies. But nature never misleads us in this way. Her language is always true, and it is only by misinterpreting it that we fall into error. There must be many accidental conjunctions of things, as well as natural connections, and the former are apt to be mistaken for the latter. Thus, in the instance above mentioned, the child connected the pain of inoculation with the surgeon, whereas it really was connected with the incision only. Philosophers and men of science are not exempted from such mistakes. Indeed, all false reasoning in philosophy is owing to them. It is drawn from experience and analogy, as well as reasoning, otherwise it could have no verisimilitude. But the one is an unskilful and rash, the other a just and legitimate, interpretation of natural signs. If a child or a man of common understanding were put to interpret a book of science wrote in his mother tongue, how many blunders and mistakes would he be apt to fall into? Yet he knows as much of this language as is necessary for his manner of life. The language of nature is the universal study, and the students are of different classes. Brutes, idiots, and children employ themselves in this study, and owe to it all their acquired perceptions. Men of common understanding make a greater progress, and learn, by a small degree of reflection, many things of which children are ignorant. Philosophers fill up the highest form in this school, and are critics in the language of nature. All these different classes have one teacher, experience, enlightened by the inductive principle. Take away the light of this inductive principle, and experience is as blind as a mole. She may indeed feel what is present, and what immediately touches her, but she sees nothing that is either before or behind, upon the right hand or upon the left, future or past. The rules of inductive reasoning, or of a just interpretation of nature, as well as the fallacies by which we are apt to misinterpret her language, have been, with wonderful sagacity, delineated by that great genius of Lord Bacon, so that his Novum Organum may justly be called a grammar of the language of nature. It adds greatly to the merit of this work, and atones for its deficits, that at the time it was written the world had not seen any tolerable model of inductive reasoning, from which the rules of it might be copied. The arts of poetry and eloquence were grown up to perfection when Aristotle described them, but the art of interpreting nature was yet in embryo when Bacon delineated its manly features and proportions. Aristotle drew his rules from the best models of those arts that have yet appeared, but the best models of inductive reasoning that have yet appeared, which I take to be the third book of Principia and the Optics of Newton, were drawn from Bacon's rules. The purpose of all those rules is to teach us to distinguish seeming or apparent connections of things in the course of nature from such as are real. They that are unskilful in inductive reasoning are more apt to fall into error in their reasonings from the phenomena of nature than in their acquired perceptions, because we often reason from a few mistakes, and thereby are apt to mistake accidental conjunctions of things for natural connections. But that habit of passing, without reasoning, from the sign to the thing signified, which constitutes acquired perception, must be learned by many instances or experiments, and the number of experiments serves to disjoin those things which have been accidentally conjoined, as well as to confirm our belief of natural connections. From the time that children begin to use their hands, nature directs them to handle everything over and over, to look at it while they handle it, and to put it in various positions, and at various distances from the eye. We are apt to excuse this as a childish diversion, because they must be doing something, and have not reason to entertain themselves in a more manly way. But if we think more justly, we shall find that they are engaged in the most serious and important study, and if they had all the reason of a philosopher, they could not be more properly employed. For it is this childish employment that enables them to make the proper use of their eyes. They are thereby every day acquiring habits of perception, which are of greater importance than anything we can teach them. The original perceptions which nature gave them are few, and insufficient for the purposes of life, and therefore she made them capable of acquiring many more perceptions by habit. And to complete her work, she hath given them an unwearied assiduity in applying to the exercises by which those perceptions are acquired. This is the education which nature gives to her children. And since we have fallen upon this subject, we may add that another part of nature's education is, that by the course of things, children must often exert all their muscular force, and employ all their ingenuity, in order to gratify their curiosity and satisfy their little appetites. What they desire is only to be obtained at the expense of labor and patience, and many disappointments. By the exercise of body and mind necessary for satisfying their desires, they acquire agility, strength, and dexterity in their motions, as well as health and vigor to their constitutions. They learn patience and perseverance. They learn to bear pain without dejection, and disappointment without despondence. The education of nature is most perfect in savages, who have no other tutor; and we see that, in the quickness of all their senses, in the agility of all their motions, in the hardiness of their constitutions, and in the strength of their minds, to bear hunger, thirst, pain, and disappointment, they commonly far exceed the civilized. A most ingenious writer on this account seems to prefer the savage life to that of society. But the education of nature could never of itself produce a Rousseau. It is the intention of nature that human education should be joined to her institution in order to form the man. And she hath fitted us for human education by the natural principles of imitation and credulity, which discover themselves almost in infancy, as well as by others which are of later growth. When the education which we receive from men does not give scope to the education of nature, it is wrong directed. It tends to hurt our faculties of perception, and to enervate both the body and mind. Nature hath her way of rearing men, as she hath of curing their diseases. The art of medicine is to follow nature, to imitate and to assist her in the cure of diseases; and the art of education is to follow nature, to assist and imitate her in the way of rearing men. The ancient inhabitants of the Balears followed nature in the manner of teaching their children to be good archers, when they hung their dinner aloft by a thread, and left the younkers to bring it down by their skill in archery. The education of nature, without any more human care than is necessary to preserve life, makes a perfect savage. Human education, joined to that of nature, may make a good citizen, a skillful artisan, or a well-bred man. But reason and reflection must superadd their tutory, in order to produce a Rousseau, a Bacon, or a Newton. Notwithstanding the innumerable errors committed in human education, there is hardly any education so bad as to be worse than none. And I apprehend that even if Rousseau were to choose whether to educate a son among the French, the Italians, the Chinese, or the Eskimos, he would not give preference to the last. When reason is properly employed, she will confirm the documents of nature, which are always true and wholesome. She will distinguish, in the documents of human education, the good from the bad, rejecting the last with modesty, and adhering to the first with reverence. Most men continue all their days to be just what nature and human education made them. Their manners, their opinions, their virtues, and their vices are all got by habit, imitation, and instruction, and reason has little or no share in forming them. End of chapter 6. Chapter 7 of an Inquiry into the Human Mind on the Principles of Common Sense. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by K. Hand. An Inquiry into the Human Mind on the Principles of Common Sense by Thomas Reid. Chapter 7. Conclusion. Containing reflections upon the opinions of philosophers on this subject. There are two ways in which men may form their notions and opinions concerning the mind and concerning its powers and operations. The first is the only way that leads to truth, but it is narrow and rugged, and few have entered upon it. The second is broad and smooth, and hath been much beaten, not only by the vulgar, but even by philosophers. It is sufficient for common life, and is well adapted to the purposes of the poet and orator, but in philosophical disquisitions concerning the mind, it leads to error and delusion. We may call the first of these ways the way of reflection. When the operations of the mind are exerted, we are conscious of them, and it is in our power to attend to them and to reflect upon them until they become familiar objects of thought. This is the only way in which we can form just and accurate notions of those operations. But this attention and reflection is so difficult to man, surrounded on all hands by external objects which constantly solicit his attention, that it has been very little practiced, even by philosophers. In the course of this inquiry, we have had many occasions to show how little attention hath been given to the most familiar operations of the senses. The second and most common way in which men form their opinions concerning the mind and its operations we may call the way of analogy. There is nothing in the course of nature so singular, but we can find some resemblance, or at least some analogy, between it and other things with which we are acquainted. The mind naturally delights in hunting after such analogies, and attends to them with pleasure. From them poetry and wit derive a greater part of their charms, and eloquence not a little of its persuasive force. Besides the pleasure we receive from analogies, they are of very considerable use, both to facilitate the conception of things, when they are not easily apprehended without such a handle, and to lead us to probable conjectures about their nature and qualities, when we want the means of more direct and immediate knowledge. When I consider that the planet Jupiter, in like manner as the Earth, rolls around its own axis and revolves around the Sun, and that he is enlightened by several secondary planets, as the Earth is enlightened by the Moon, I am apt to conjecture from analogy that as the Earth by these means is fitted to be the habitation of various orders of animals, so the planet Jupiter is, by the like means, fitted for the same purpose, and have no argument more direct and conclusive to determine me in this point, I yield to this analogical reasoning a degree of assent proportioned to its strength. When I observe that the potato plant very much resembles the solanum in its flower and fructification, and am informed that the last is poisonous, I am apt from analogy to have some suspicion of the former. But in this case I have access to more direct and certain evidences, and therefore ought not to trust analogy, which would lead me in error. Arguments from analogy are always at hand and grow up spontaneously in a fruitful imagination, while arguments that are more direct and more conclusive often require painful attention and application, and therefore mankind in general have been very much disposed to trust the former. If one attentively examines the systems of the ancient philosophers, either concerning the material world or concerning the mind, he will find them to be built solely upon the foundation of analogy. Lord Bacon first delineated the strict and severe method of induction. Since his time it has been applied with very happy success in some parts of natural philosophy, and hardly in anything else. But there is no subject in which mankind are so much disposed to trust to the analogical way of thinking and reasoning, as in what concerns the mind and its operations; because, to form clear and distinct notions of those operations in the direct and proper way, and to reason about them, requires a habit of attentive reflection of which few are capable, and which, even by these few, cannot be attained without much pains and labour. Every man is apt to form his notions of things difficult to be apprehended, or less familiar, from their analogy to things which are more familiar. Thus, if a man bred to the seafaring life, and accustomed to think and talk only of matters relating to navigation, enters into discourse upon any other subject, it is well known that the language and notions proper to his own profession are infused into every subject, and all things are measured by the rules of navigation. And if he should take it into his head to philosophize concerning the faculties of the mind, it cannot be doubted but he would draw his notions from the fabric of his ship, and would find in the mind sails, masts, rudder, and compass. Sensible objects of one kind or another do no less occupy and engross the rest of mankind than things relating to navigation, the seafaring man. For a considerable part of life we can think of nothing but the objects of sense, and to attend to objects of another nature, so as to form clear and distinct notions of them, is no easy matter, even after we come to years of reflection. The condition of mankind, therefore, affords good reason to apprehend that their language and their common notions concerning the mind and its operations will be analogical, and derived from the objects of sense; and that these analogies will be apt to impose upon philosophers, as well upon the vulgar, and to lead them to materialize the mind and its faculties. And experience abundantly confirms the truth of this. How generally men of all nations and in all ages of the world have conceived the soul, or thinking principle in man, to be some subtle matter, like breath or wind, the names given to it in almost all languages sufficiently testify. We have words which are proper, and not analogical, to express the various ways in which we perceive external objects by the senses, such as feeling, sight, taste; but we are often obliged to use these words analogically, to express either powers of the mind which are of a very different nature. And the powers which imply some degree of reflection have generally no names but such as are analogical. The objects of thought are said to be in the mind, to be apprehended, comprehended, conceived, imagined, retained, weighed, ruminated. It does not appear that the notions of the ancient philosophers with regard to the nature of the soul were much more refined than those of the vulgar, or that they were formed in any other way. We shall distinguish the philosophy that regards our subject into the old and the new. The old reached down to Descartes, who gave it a fatal blow, of which it has been gradually expiring ever since, and is now almost extinct. Descartes is the father of the new philosophy that relates to the subject, but it hath been gradually improving since his time, upon the principles laid down by him. The old philosophy seems to have been purely analogical. The new is more derived from reflection, but still with a very considerable mixture of the old analogical notions. Because the objects of sense consist of matter and form, the ancient philosophers conceived everything to belong to one of these, or to be made up of both. Some therefore thought that the soul is a particular kind of subtle matter, separable from our gross bodies; others thought that it is only a particular form of the body, and inseparable from it. For there seem to have been some among the ancients, as well as some among the moderns, who conceive that a certain structure or organization of the body is all that is necessary to render it sensible and intelligent. The different powers of the mind were, accordingly, by the last sect of philosophers, conceived to belong to different parts of the body, as the heart, the brain, the liver, the stomach, the blood. They who thought that the soul is a subtle matter separable from the body disputed to which of the four elements it belongs, whether to earth, water, air, or fire. Of the three last, each had its particular advocates, but some were of the opinion that it partakes of all the elements, that it must have something in its composition similar to everything we perceive, and that we perceive earth by the earthly part, water by the watery part, and fire by the fiery part of the soul. Some philosophers, not satisfied with the determining of what kind of matter the soul is made, inquired likewise into its figure, which they determined to be spherical, that it might be the more fit for motion. The most spiritual and sublime notion concerning the nature of the soul to be met with among the ancient philosophers, I conceive to be that of the Platonists, who held that it is made of that celestial and incorruptible matter of which the fixed stars were made, and therefore has a natural tendency to rejoin its proper element. I am at a loss to say in which of these classes of philosophers Aristotle ought to be placed. He defines the soul to be the first entelechia of a natural body which has potential life. I beg to be excused from translating the Greek word because I know not the meaning of it. The notions of the ancient philosophers with regard to the operations of the mind, particularly with regard to perceptions and ideas, seem likewise to have been formed by the same kind of analogy. Plato, of the writers that are extant, first introduced the word idea into philosophy, but his doctrine upon this subject had somewhat peculiar. He agreed with the rest of the ancient philosophers in this, that all things consist of matter and form, and that the matter of which all things were made existed from eternity without form, but he likewise believed that there are eternal forms of all possible things which exist without matter, and to these eternal and immaterial forms he gave the name of ideas, maintaining that they are the only object of true knowledge. It is of no great moment to us whether he borrowed these notions from Parmenides or whether they were the issue of his own creative imagination. The latter Platonists seem to have improved upon them, in conceiving those ideas, or external forms of things, to exist, not of themselves, but in the divine mind, and to be the models and patterns according to which all things were made. Then lived the Eternal One, then deep retired in his unfathomed essence, viewed at large the uncreated images of things. To these Platonic notions, that of Malebranche is very nearly allied. This author seems, more than any other, to have been aware of the difficulties attending to the common hypothesis concerning ideas, to wit, that ideas of all objects of thought are in the human mind, and therefore, in order to avoid those difficulties, makes the ideas which are the immediate objects of human thought to be the ideas of things in the divine mind, who, being intimately present to every human mind, may discover his ideas to it as far as pleaseth him. The Platonists and the Malebranche excepted, all other philosophers, as far as I know, have conceived that there are ideas or images of every object of thought in the human mind, or at least in some part of the brain, where the mind is supposed to have its residence. Aristotle had no good affection to the word idea, and seldom or never uses it but in refuting Plato's notions about ideas. He thought that matter may exist without form, but that form cannot exist without matter. But at the same time he taught that there can be no sensation, no imagination, nor intellection without forms, phantasms, or species in the mind, and that things sensible are perceived by sensible species, and things intelligible by intelligible species. His followers taught more explicitly that those sensible and intelligible species are set forth by the objects, and make their impressions upon the passive intellect, and that the active intellect perceives them in the passive intellect. And this seems to have been the common opinion, while the peripatetic philosophy retained its authority. The Epicurean doctrine, as explained by Lucretius, though widely different from the peripatetic in many things, is almost the same in this. He reaffirms that slender films or ghosts, tenua rerum simulacra, are still going off from all things and flying about, and that these being extremely subtle, easily penetrate our gross bodies, and striking upon the mind cause thought and imagination. After the peripatetic system had reigned above 1,000 years in the schools of Europe, almost without a rival, it sunk before that of Descartes, the perspicuity of whose writings and notions, contrasted with the obscurity of Aristotle and his commentators, created a strong prejudice in favor of this new philosophy. The characteristic of Plato's genius was sublimity, that of Aristotle's subtlety, but Descartes far excelled in both perspicuity, and bequeathed this spirit to his successors. The system which is now generally received with regard to the mind and its operations derives not only its spirit from Descartes, but its fundamental principles, and after all the improvements made by Malebranche, Locke, Berkeley, and Hume, may still be called the Cartesian system. We shall therefore make some remarks upon its spirit and tendency in general, and upon its doctrine concerning ideas in particular. It may be observed that the method which Descartes pursued naturally led him to attend more to the operations of the mind by accurate reflection, and to trust less to analogical reasoning upon this subject, than any philosopher had done before him. Intending to build a system upon a new foundation, he began with the resolution to admit nothing but what was absolutely certain and evident. He supposed that his senses, his memory, his reason, and every other faculty to which we trust in common life, might be fallacious, and resolved to disbelieve everything, until he was compelled by irresistible evidence to yield assent. In this method of proceeding, what appeared to him first of all certain and evident was, that he thought, that he doubted, that he deliberated. In a word, the operations of his own mind, of which he was conscious, must be real, and no delusion, and though all his other faculties should deceive him, his consciousness could not. This therefore he looked upon as the first of all truths. This was the first firm ground upon which he set his foot, after being tossed in the ocean of skepticism, and he resolved to build all knowledge upon it, without seeking after any more first principles. As every other truth, therefore, and particularly the existence of the objects of sense, was to be deduced by a train of strict argumentation from what he knew by consciousness, he was naturally led to give attention to the operations of which he was conscious, without borrowing his notions of them from external things. It was not in the way of analogy, but attentive reflection, that he was led to observe that thought, volition, remembrance, and the other attributes of the mind are altogether unlike to extension, to figure, and to all other attributes of the body, and that we have no reason, therefore, to conceive thinking substances to have any resemblance to extend substances, and that, as the attributes of thinking substance are things of which we are conscious, we may have a more certain and immediate knowledge of them by reflection, than we can have of external objects by our senses. These observations, as far as I know, were first made by Descartes, and they are of more importance and throw more light upon the subject than all that had been said upon it before. They ought to make us diffident and jealous of every notion concerning the mind and its operations, which is drawn from sensible objects in the way of analogy, and to make us rely only upon accurate reflection as the source of all real knowledge upon this subject. 2. I observe that as the peripatetic system has a tendency to materialize in the mind and its operations, so the Cartesian has a tendency to spiritualize body and its qualities. One error common to both systems leads to the first of these extremes in the way of analogy, and to the last in the way of reflection. The error, I mean, is, that we can know nothing about body or its qualities but as far as we have sensations which resemble those qualities. Both systems agreed in this, but according to their different methods of reasoning they drew very different conclusions from it. The peripatetic drawing his notions of sensation from the qualities of body, the Cartesian, on the contrary, drawing his notions of the qualities of body from his sensations. The peripatetic, taking it for granted that bodies and their qualities do really exist, and are such as we commonly take them to be, inferred from them the nature of his sensations, and reasoned in this manner. Our sensations are the impressions which sensible objects make upon the mind, and may be compared to the impression of a seal upon wax. The impression is the image or form of the seal, without the matter of it. In like manner, every sensation is the image or form of some sensible quality of the object. This is the reasoning of Aristotle, and it has an evident tendency to materialize the mind and its sensations. The Cartesian, on the contrary, thinks that the existence of body, or of any of its qualities, is not to be taken as a first principle, and that we ought to admit nothing concerning it but what, by just reasoning, can be deduced from our sensations. And he knows that by reflection we can form clear and distinct notions of our sensations, without borrowing our notions of them by analogy from the objects of sense. The Cartesians, therefore, beginning to give attention to their sensations, first discovered that the sensations corresponding to secondary qualities cannot resemble any quality of the body. Hence Descartes and Locke inferred that sound, taste, smell, color, heat, and cold, which the vulgar took to be qualities of the body, were not qualities of body, but of mere sensations of the mind. Afterward, the ingenious Berkeley, considering more attentively the nature of sensation in general, discovered and demonstrated that no sensation whatever could possibly resemble any quality of an insentient being, such as a body is supposed to be, and hence he inferred, very justly, that there is the same reason to hold extension, figure, and all the primary qualities to be mere sensations, as there is to hold the secondary qualities to be mere sensations. Thus, by just reasoning upon the Cartesian principles, matter was stripped of all its qualities. The new system, by a kind of metaphysical sublimation, converted all the qualities of matter into sensations, and spiritualized body, as the old had materialized spirit. The way to avoid both these extremes is, to admit the existence of what we see and feel as a first principle, as well as the existence of things whereof we are conscious, and to take our notions of the qualities of body from the testimony of our senses, with the Peripatetics, and our notions of our sensations from the testimony of consciousness, with the Cartesians. 3. I observed that the modern skepticism is the natural issue of the new system, and that, although it did not bring forth this monster into the year 1739, it may be said to have carried it in its womb from the beginning. The old system admitted all the principles of common sense as first principles without requiring any proof of them, and therefore, though its reasoning was commonly vague, analogical, and dark, yet it was built upon a broad foundation, and had no tendency to skepticism. We do not find that any peripatetic thought it incumbent upon him to prove the existence of a material world, but every writer upon the Cartesian system attempted this, until Berkeley clearly demonstrated the futility of their arguments, and thence concluded that there was no such thing as a material world, and that the belief of it ought to be rejected as a vulgar error. The new system admits only of the principles of common sense as the first principle, and pretends, by strict augmentation, to deduce all the rest from it. That our thoughts, our sensations, and everything of which we are conscious hath a real existence, is admitted in this system as a first principle, but everything else must be made evident by the light of reason. Reason must rear the whole fabric of knowledge upon this single principle of consciousness. There is a disposition in human nature to reduce things to as few principles as possible, and this, without doubt, adds to the beauty of a system, if the principles are able to support what rests upon them. The mathematicians glory, very justly, in having raised so noble and magnificent a system of science upon the foundation of a few axioms and definitions. This love of simplicity, of reducing things to few principles, hath produced many a false system, but there never was any system in which it appears so remarkably as that of Descartes. His whole system concerning matter and spirit is built upon one axiom, expressed in one word, cogito. Upon the foundation of conscious thought, with ideas for his materials, he builds his system of human understanding, and attempts to account for all its phenomena. And having, as he imagined from his consciousness, proved the existence of matter and of a certain quantity of motion originally impressed upon it, he builds his system of the material world, and attempts to account for all its phenomena. These principles, with regard to the material system, have been found insufficient, and it has been made evident that besides matter and motion we must admit gravitation, cohesion, corpuscular attraction, magnetism, and other centripetal and centrifugal forces, by which the particles of matter attract and repel each other. Newton, having discovered this and demonstrated that these principles cannot be resolved into matter and motion, was led by analogy and the love of simplicity to conjecture, but with a modesty and caution peculiar to him, that all the phenomena of the material world depended upon attracting and repelling forces in the particles of matter. But we may now venture to say that this conjecture fell short of the mark, for even in the unorganized kingdom, the powers by which salts, crystals, spars, and many other bodies concrete into regular forms, can never be accounted for by attracting and repelling forces in the particles of matter. And in the vegetable and animal kingdoms there are strong indications of powers of a different nature from all the powers of unorganized bodies. We see, then, that although in the structure of the material world there is, without a doubt, all the beautiful simplicity consistent with the purposes for which it was made, it is not so simple as the great Descartes determined it to be. Nay, it is not so simple as the greater Newton modestly conjectured it to be. Both were misled by analogy and the love of simplicity. One had been much conversant about the extension, figure, and motion; the other had enlarged his views to attracting and repelling forces; and both formed their notions of unknown parts of nature from those with which they were acquainted, as the shepherd Tityrus formed his notion of the city of Rome from his country village. Urbem quam dicunt Romam melibae putabi, stultos ego huic nostre similem, quo saepe solemus, pastores oveum teneros depellere fatus. Sic canibus catulos similes, sic matribus aidos. Noram, sic parvis componere magna solebam. This is just a picture of the analogical way of thinking. But to come to the system of Descartes concerning the human understanding, it was built, as we have observed, upon consciousness as its sole foundation, and with ideas as its materials, and all his followers have built upon the same foundation and with the same materials. They acknowledge that nature hath given us various simple ideas. These are analogous to the matter of Descartes' physical system. They acknowledge likewise a natural power by which ideas are compounded, disjoined, associated, compared. This is analogous to the original quantity of motion in Descartes' physical system. From these principles they attempt to explain the phenomena of the human understanding, just as in the physical system the phenomena of nature were to be explained by matter and motion. It must indeed be acknowledged that there is great simplicity in this system as well as in the other. There is such a similitude between the two as may be expected between children of the same father, but as the one has been found to be the child of Descartes and not of nature, there is ground to think that the other is so likewise. That the natural issue of this system is skepticism with regard to everything except the existence of our ideas and of their necessary relations, which appear upon comparing them, is evident. For ideas being the only objects of thought, and having no existence but when we are conscious of them, it necessarily follows that there is no object of our thought which can have a continued and permanent existence. Body and spirit, cause and effect, time and space, to which we were wont to ascribe an existence independent of our thought, are all turned out of existence by this short dilemma. Either these things are ideas of sensation or reflection, or they are not. If they are ideas of sensation or reflection, they can have no existence but when we are conscious of them. If they are not ideas of sensation or reflection, they are words without any meaning. Neither Descartes nor Locke perceived this consequence of their system concerning ideas. Bishop Berkeley was the first who discovered it. And what followed upon this discovery? Why, with regard to the material world, and with regard to space and time, he admits the consequence, that these things are mere ideas and have no existence but in our minds. But with regard to the existence of spirits or minds, he does not admit the consequence, and if he had admitted it, he must have been an absolute skeptic. But how does he evade this consequence with regard to the existence of spirits? The expedient which the good bishop uses on this occasion is very remarkable, and shows his great aversion to skepticism. He maintains that we have no ideas of spirits, and that we can think and speak and reason about them, and about their attributes, without having any ideas of them. If this is so, my lord, what should hinder us from thinking and reasoning about bodies and their qualities, without having ideas of them? The bishop either did not think of this question, nor did think fit to give any answer to it. However, we may observe that in order to avoid skepticism, he fairly starts out of the Cartesian system, without giving any reason why he did so in this instance and in no other. This indeed is the only instance of a deviation from Cartesian principles which I have met with in the successors of Descartes, and it seems to have been only a sudden start occasioned by the terror of skepticism, for in all other things Berkeley's system is founded upon Cartesian principles. Thus we see that Descartes and Locke take the road that leads to skepticism without knowing the end of it, but they stop short for want of light to carry them farther. Berkeley, frightened at the appearance of the dreadful abyss, starts aside and avoids it. But the author of the Treatise of Human Nature, more daring and intrepid, without turning aside to the right hand or to the left, like Virgil's Alecto, shoots directly into the gulf. Expecis horrendum et saevi spiracula ditis, monstrantur ruptoque ingens ercerante vorago, pestiferas apert fauces. 4. We may observe that the account given by the new system of that furniture of the human understanding which is the gift of nature, and not the acquisition of our own reasoning faculty, is extremely lame and imperfect. The natural furniture of the human understanding is of two kinds. First, the notions or simple apprehensions which we have of things, and secondly, the judgments, or the belief which we have concerning them. As to our notions, the new system reduces them to two classes, ideas of sensation and ideas of reflection. The first are conceived to be copies of our sensations, retained in the memory or imagination; the second to be copies of the operations of our minds, whereof we are conscious, in like manner retained in the memory or imagination; and we are taught that these two comprehend all the materials about which the human understanding is or can be employed. As to our judgment of things, or the belief which we have concerning them, the new system allows no part of it to be the gift of nature, but holds it to be the acquisition of reason, and to be got by comparing our ideas and perceiving their agreements or disagreements. Now I take this account, both of our notions and of our judgments or belief, to be extremely imperfect, and I shall briefly point out some of its capital defects. The division of our notions into ideas of sensation and ideas of reflection is contrary to all rules of logic, because the second member of the division includes the first. For, can we form clear and just notions of our sensations any other way than by reflection? Surely we cannot. Sensation is an operation of the mind of which we are conscious, and we get the notion of sensation by reflecting upon that which we are conscious of. In like manner, doubting and believing are operations of the mind whereof we are conscious. We get the notion of them by reflecting upon what we are conscious of. The ideas of sensation, therefore, are ideas of reflection as much as the ideas of doubt or believing or any other ideas whatsoever. But to pass over the inaccuracy of this division, it is extremely incomplete. For since sensation is an operation of the mind as well as all the other things of which we form our notions by reflection, when it is asserted that all our notions are either ideas of sensation or ideas of reflection, the plain English of this is, that mankind neither do nor can think of anything but of the operations of their own mind. Nothing can be more contrary to truth, or more contrary to the experience of mankind. I know that Locke, while he maintained this doctrine, believed the notions which we have of body and of its qualities, and the notions which we have of motion and of space, to be the ideas of sensation. But why did he believe this? Because he believed those notions to be nothing else but images of our sensations. If, therefore, the notions of body and its qualities, of motion and space, be not images of our sensations, will it not follow that those notions are not ideas of sensation? Most certainly. There is no doctrine in the new system which more directly leads to skepticism than this. And the author of the Treatise of Human Nature knew very well how to use it for that purpose. For if you maintain that there is any such existence as body or spirit, time or place, cause or effect, he immediately catches you between the horns of this dilemma. Your notions of these existences are either ideas of sensation or ideas of reflection. If of sensation, from what sensation are they copied? If of reflection, from what operations of the mind are they copied? It is indeed to be wished that those who have written much about sensation, and about the other operations of the mind, had likewise thought and reflected much, and with great care, upon those operations. But is it not very strange that they will not allow it to be possible for mankind to think of anything else? The account which this system gives of our judgment and belief concerning things is as far from the truth as the account it gives of our notions or simple apprehensions. It represents our senses as having no other office but that of furnishing the mind with notions or simple apprehensions of things, and makes our judgment and belief concerning those things to be acquired by comparing our notions together and perceiving their agreements or disagreements. We have shown, on the contrary, that every operation of the senses in its very nature implies judgment or belief as well as simple apprehension. Thus, when I feel the pain of the gout in my toe, I have not only a notion of pain, but a belief of its existence, and a belief of some disorder in my toe which occasions it, and this belief is not produced by comparing ideas and perceiving their agreements and disagreements. It is included in the very nature of the sensation. When I perceive a tree before me, my faculty of seeing gives me not only a notion or simple apprehension of the tree, but a belief of its existence, and of its figure, distance, and magnitude, and this judgment or belief is not got by comparing ideas, it is included in the very nature of the perception. We have taken notice of several original principles of belief in the course of this inquiry, and when other faculties of the mind are examined, we shall find more which have not occurred in the examination of the five senses. Such original and natural judgments are therefore a part of that furniture which nature hath given to the human understanding. They are the inspiration of the Almighty, no less than our notions or simple apprehensions. They serve to direct us in the common affairs of life where our reasoning faculty would leave us in the dark. They are a part of our constitution, and all the discoveries of our reason are grounded upon them. They make up what is called the common sense of mankind, and what is manifestly contrary to any of those first principles is what we call absurd. The strength of them is good sense, which is often found in those who are not acute in reasoning. A remarkable deviation from them, arising from a disorder in the constitution, is what we call lunacy, as when a man believes that he is made of glass. When a man suffers himself to be reasoned out of the principles of common sense by a metaphysical arguments, we may call this metaphysical lunacy, which differs from the other species of the distemper in this, that it is not continued, but intermittent. It is apt to seize the patient in solitary and speculative moments, but when he enters into society, common sense recovers her authority. A clear explication and enumeration of the principles of common sense is one of the chief desiderata in logic. We have only considered such of them as occurred in the examination of the five senses. 5. The last observation that I shall make upon the new system is, that although it professes to set out in the way of reflection and not of analogy, it hath retained some of the old analogical notions concerning the operations of the mind, particularly that things which do not exist in the mind itself can only be perceived, remembered, or imagined, by means of ideas or images of them in the mind, which are the immediate objects of perception, remembrance, and imagination. This doctrine appears evidently to be borrowed from the old system, which taught that external things make impressions upon the mind, like the impressions of a seal upon wax, that it is by means of those impressions that we perceive, remember, or imagine them, and that those impressions must resemble the things from which they are taken. When we form our notions of the operations of the mind by analogy, this way of conceiving them seems to be very natural, and offers itself to our thoughts. For as everything which is felt must make some impression upon the body, we are apt to think that everything which is understood must make some impression upon the mind. From such analogical reasoning, this opinion of the existence of ideas or images of things in the mind seems to have taken its rise, and to have been so universally received among philosophers. It was observed already that Berkeley, in one instance, apostatizes from this principle of the new system, by affirming that we have no ideas of spirits, and that we can think of them immediately without ideas. But I know not whether in this he has had any followers. There is some difference likewise among modern philosophers with regard to the ideas or images by which we perceive, remember, or imagine sensible things. For though all agree in the existence of such images, they differ about their place, some placing them in a particular part of the brain, where the soul is thought to have her residence, and others placing them in the mind itself. Descartes held the first of these opinions, to which Newton seems likewise to have inclined, for he proposes this query in his Optics: Anon sensorium animalum est locus qui substantia sentiens adest, en quim sensibilis rerum species per nervos et cerebrum desferuntur, ut ibi presentes a presente sentire possint. But Locke seems to place the ideas of sensible things in the mind, and that Berkeley and the author of the Treatise of Human Nature were of the same opinion is evident. The last makes a very curious application of this doctrine, by endeavoring to prove from it that the mind either is no substance, or that it is an extended and divisible substance, because the ideas of extension cannot be in a subject which is indivisible and unextended. I confess I think his reasoning in this, as in most cases, is clear and strong. For whether the idea of extension be only another name for extension itself, as Berkeley and his author assert, or whether the idea of extension be an image and resemblance of extension, as Locke conceived, I appeal to any man of common sense whether extension, or any image of extension, can be in an unextended and indivisible object. But while I agree with him in his reasoning, I would make a different application of it. He takes it for granted that there are ideas of extension in the mind, and thence infers that if it is at all a substance, it must be an extended and divisible substance. On the contrary, I take it for granted, upon the testimony of common sense, that my mind is a substance, that is, a permanent subject of thought, and my reason convinces me that it is an unextended and indivisible substance, and hence I infer that there cannot be in it anything that resembles extension. If this reasoning had occurred to Berkeley, it would probably have led him to acknowledge that we may think and reason concerning bodies without having ideas of them in the mind, as well as concerning spirits. I intended to have examined more particularly and fully this doctrine of the existence of ideas or images of things in the mind, and likewise another doctrine which is founded upon it, to wit, that judgment or belief is nothing but a perception of the agreement or disagreement of our ideas. But having already shewn, through the course of this inquiry, that the operations of the mind which we have examined give no countenance to either of these doctrines, and in many things contradict them, I have thought it proper to drop this part of my design. It may be educated with more advantage, if it is at all necessary, after inquiring into some other powers of the human understanding. Although we have examined only the 5 senses and the principles of the human mind which are employed about them, or such as have fallen in our way in the course of this examination, we shall leave the further prosecution of this inquiry to future deliberation. The powers of memory, of imagination, of taste, of reasoning, of moral perception, the will, the passions, the affections, and all the active powers of the soul, present a vast and boundless field of philosophical disquisition, which the author of this inquiry is far from thinking himself able to survey with accuracy. Many authors of ingenuity, ancient and modern, have made excursions into this vast territory, and have communicated useful observations. But there is reason to believe that those who have pretended to give us a map of the whole have satisfied themselves with a very inaccurate and incomplete survey. If Galileo had attempted a complete system of natural philosophy, he had, probably, done little service to mankind. But by confining himself to what was within his comprehension, he laid the foundation of a system of knowledge, which rises by degrees and does honor to the human understanding. Newton, building upon this foundation, and in like manner confining his inquiries to the law of gravitation and the properties of light, performed wonders. If he had attempted a great deal more, he had done a great deal less, and perhaps nothing at all. Ambitious of following such great examples with unequal steps, alas, and unequal force, we have attempted an inquiry only into one little corner of the human mind, that corner which seems to be most exposed to vulgar observation, and to be most easily comprehended. And yet, if we have delineated it justly, it must be acknowledged that the accounts heretofore given of it were very lame and wide of the truth. The End. End of Chapter 7. End of an inquiry into the human mind on the principles of common sense, by Thomas Reid.